Good evening, dear friend. I'm glad you're here. Tonight, let's set aside the restless worries of the day. The world will wait until morning. For now, we have the gift of stillness, the comfort of memory, and the warmth of a story carried slowly through the night. Frontier families once knew a secret that we have nearly forgotten: how to greet the coldest nights not with panic, but with quiet rituals of care. They built small sanctuaries against the winter, and in those sanctuaries, every ember, every quilt, every whispered word mattered. If you find comfort in these stories, I invite you, softly, without urgency, to like or subscribe, so that you'll have more evenings like this waiting for you. And if you wish, share in the comments where you are listening from and what the night feels like in your corner of the world. Now, dim the lights, or let the window stay open to the night air. Listen for the hum of a fan, or imagine the hush of a stove cooling at day's end. Let yourself breathe more slowly. Tonight's journey begins here, where a small ember holds more than warmth. A small ember holds more than warmth. Imagine the hush of a cabin, the kind built from pine logs notched by hand, its roof heavy with snow that muffles every sound. Inside, the air has cooled during the long hours after midnight. A single stove crouches in the corner, its iron sides dulled from years of use. Within it, a few coals remain, glowing faintly like eyes peering through ash. That faint light is all that stands between comfort and despair. The quiet longing in such a moment is not dramatic. It isn't spoken aloud. It is felt in the body, an ache in the fingertips, a small wish that the fire will catch, a hope that children will not stir from under their quilts, shivering. The ember itself becomes a kind of prayer. Let it last a little longer, just long enough to coax flame again. Frontier families knew this longing well. They did not rely on central heating or electric blankets. They relied on rituals, kindling cut thin and stacked with care, logs chosen in summer for how they would burn in January, moss pressed deep into walls to keep the drafts at bay. These acts were small but repeated daily, quiet as breathing. Each one whispered the same wish: that warmth would endure. Outside, the night pressed close, hard and cold. The trees stood motionless, their branches brittle with frost. Even the stars seemed sharper in such cold, as though they might cut the sky itself. Yet inside, though the air was icy, there was a deeper sense of safety. The ember gave more than heat. It gave reassurance. It promised that the knowledge of many winters was still alive. Picture a child waking for just a moment, peeking out from under layers of quilt. She sees the faint glow in the stove, hears her father's slow movements, senses her mother's steady breathing. She doesn't know the science of combustion or the calculations of wood supply. What she knows is the ember means she can close her eyes again and trust the night to pass. There's a tenderness in this simple scene. A father bending low to blow on coals, his breath steady, careful not to scatter ash. A mother reaching for a candle, shielding its small flame with her hand so it won't falter. Their movements are practiced, yet never careless. Each action carries the weight of many years, of times when fire almost failed and lessons were learned dearly. This longing for warmth was not only about survival, it was also about togetherness. In the depth of cold, family members drew close, sharing quilts, sharing beds, sharing even the heat of a dog nestled at their feet. The ember stood at the heart of it all, tiny, fragile, but strong enough to knit the household into a circle of safety. You might think of your own small rituals at night. The blanket you fold just so, the lamp you switch off, the way you listen to the settling of your home before sleep. these are not so different. They too are embers, small comforts carrying us through the long hours until dawn. In this way, the ember holds more than warmth. It carries longing, memory, and quiet hope. It is the pause before dawn, the fragile thread between night's danger and morning's relief. And as you rest tonight, you may feel your own ember within you, glowing softly, enough to last until morning. Winter's arrival whispers through silent fields. Winter on the frontier did not begin with a date marked on a calendar. It did not announce itself with fanfare or ceremony. It arrived in whispers, a shift in the sound of the wind, the brittle crackle of grass underfoot, the stillness of animals pausing at the tree line. Long before the heaviest snow, families recognized the signals. A frost creeping across window panes, delicate as lace. The sharp tang of smoke carried on the air from a neighbor's chimney, reminding them that fires now burned almost constantly. Even the light of day altered, turning thin and angled, laying long shadows over fields that only weeks before shimmered with the last of summer's harvest. For those who lived through it, the edge of winter was not frightening. It was sobering. It meant the clock of survival had begun again. The cold had crossed a threshold, and the season would demand attention, patience, and care. Inside a cabin, you might imagine a woman pausing in her work, her hand resting on the windowsill as she studies the sky. The sun hangs low, though it is only afternoon, and the clouds are bruised with a purple that suggests snow. She does not call out her thought. She does not need to. The others in the house know the same signs. Her husband, sharpening an axe near the stove, slows his rhythm. The children, busy with slates and chalk, fall quieter, aware of the unspoken change. Even the family dog lifts its head, ears pricked toward the shifting wind outside. The first snow rarely arrived in violence. It often drifted down gently, as though testing the earth, covering the stubble of fields, softening fence posts, filling the air with a silence so deep it felt like the land itself was listening. That silence was its own announcement. Winter had settled in. And yet, there was beauty in this moment. Beauty that made even hardship seem noble. Imagine stepping outside into the first snowfall of the season, the ground crunching beneath your boots, the flakes brushing your eyelashes. The world looked renewed, clean, hushed. For a brief while, before the drifts grew high and the storms howled, there was wonder. Children laughed, trying to catch flakes on their tongues, while parents allowed themselves a smile, knowing that joy would be harder to come by in January's deep freeze. But beauty and burden always walked together. Winter's edge meant that from this day forward, mistakes would cost more dearly. A carelessly left bucket of water would freeze solid overnight. A forgotten log left on the ground would be locked under ice, impossible to split when needed most. Every small act mattered, and the rhythm of life grew precise, like the ticking of an invisible clock. Cabins, too, shifted into their winter selves. Quilts were brought down from storage and hung over windows, layered not for decoration, but for insulation. Wooden chests were opened, revealing garments that smelled faintly of cedar and smoke. Boots were mended with patches of leather, mittens lined again with scraps of rabbit fur. Children helped without complaint, for they knew these small tasks were threads in the great fabric of survival. The nights lengthened quickly. What had been evenings of work and fading light became long hours by lamplight. The flame of an oil lamp or a candle grew into its own universe, a pool of warmth, a circle of comfort in a cabin surrounded by cold and silence. Around that flame, stories were told, not dramatic tales, but steady ones. a memory of last winter, a quiet laugh about a mistake made long ago, a whispered reminder to keep the fire banked properly before sleep. There was no doubt in anyone's mind that winter would test them. Each year, even the strongest felt its weight. Yet, within that inevitability lay a kind of peace. The edge of winter brought clarity. Life narrowed to essentials: food, warmth, family, shelter. The noise of the outside world, of faraway towns or politics or gossip, melted away like the last thin ice on a river. What remained was elemental. Imagine, then, lying in bed during those first cold nights, the quilts heavy, the mattress stuffed with straw or corn husks that rustle faintly when you move. The air near the floor is cold, but up near your chin, where the blankets mound, there is comfort. You hear the soft breathing of siblings close by, the occasional sigh of a parent turning in their bed, the gentle scrape of a log shifting in the stove. The house has tucked itself in for winter, and outside, the land waits. Trees groan under the growing weight of snow. Streams slow until they freeze solid. Stars pierce the sky with a brightness only cold can provide. Winter has arrived, not yet brutal, but insistent. It has taken its place at the edge of life, reminding every soul that the season of testing has begun. This moment, this edge, is both threshold and promise. It says, you are small, but you are capable. It says, the cold is coming, but so too are the rituals that will keep you safe. For the frontier family, winter's arrival whispered rather than shouted. It did not terrify, it steadied. And as they pulled quilts tighter, sealed windows with rags, and checked the woodpile one last time, they did so with quiet resolve. Because survival was not a battle to be won in a single night. It was a practice, day after day, ember after ember, log after log. Winter's edge was simply the reminder. The practice begins again now. Gentle chores guide the morning into light. Morning on the frontier did not begin with an alarm clock or the rush of schedules. It began with the smallest of sounds, the faint stir of coals in the stove, the soft creak of wood settling in the cold, the sigh of a child turning beneath heavy quilts. The sun had not yet risen, but the household was already awakening, not with urgency, but with steady purpose. In such winters, the first task of the day was not spoken aloud, for everyone knew it by heart. The fire had to be tended. Before anything else could happen, before water was warmed, before food was prepared, before the children shook the sleep from their eyes, the fire demanded attention. Without it, there was no morning, only cold pressing in. Imagine a father rising from his bed, already layered in wool and flannel, his breath visible in the faint gray light. His boots wait by the door, but for now he moves quietly, stocking feet on the plank floor. He kneels at the stove, his face lit by the dim glow within. He does not rush. He studies the embers, judges their strength, considers the kindling stacked nearby. Each movement is careful, almost reverent. Behind him, the mother stirs. She reaches for the kettle, testing it with a practiced hand. Empty. She sets it aside, already thinking of snow to be gathered and melted. Her hands move without wasted motion. She shakes out a shawl, pulls it over her shoulders, and begins arranging the small table near the stove, where breakfast will be made. These are not grand acts, yet they carry the weight of survival. The family knows that every gesture counts. A log placed carelessly in the stove can smother the flame. A bucket left uncovered overnight can freeze solid, delaying the day's tasks. Even the placement of quilts near windows matters, for one loosened corner can let in drafts that steal precious warmth. Children, too, played their part in these quiet mornings. The older ones might be asked to check the rags stuffed in window frames, pressing them firmly into place. Another might gather an armful of wood from the indoor stack, brushing away snow crystals before handing each piece to their father. The youngest remained bundled under covers, their breath forming faint clouds, their task simply to stay warm. Outdoors, the landscape was still locked in pre-dawn stillness. Snow lay deep, reflecting what little light the sky offered. The barn stood silent, its animals huddled together for warmth. A rooster might give a half-hearted crow, muffled by the cold, more ritual than announcement. All of nature seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the first touch of sun. Inside, though, life moved forward in small, deliberate steps. The father coaxed flames from embers until the stove began to breathe again, iron sides warming with gentle pops and sighs. The mother measured out cornmeal, her hands steady even as her breath rose in the chilly air. A daughter checked the bucket of snow set near the stove last night, breaking through the crust of ice with a wooden spoon. Slowly, water began to form, steam rising as the heat claimed it. There was comfort in these routines. Ordinary chores, repeated day after day, created a rhythm that steadied the heart. One might say the tasks were monotonous, but for those who lived them, monotony meant safety. If the fire caught as it should, if the kettle filled, if the bread rose in the Dutch oven, then the family could trust they were on the right path. Consider how the sounds of morning built themselves into a quiet symphony. The crackle of new wood in the stove, the scrape of a chair leg across the floor, the whisper of fabric as quilts were folded back, the clink of a tin cup set on the table. None of these sounds were loud, yet together they wove a tapestry of reassurance. The household was alive, awake, and prepared. Not all tasks were purely practical. There was tenderness, too. A mother might pause to tuck a child's scarf closer around their neck, or to place a hand on a forehead to be sure no illness was stirring. A father might allow his son to blow gently on the embers, guiding his breath with patient instruction, knowing that someday the boy would be responsible for the morning fire himself. These moments, small and fleeting, carried more weight than words could convey. Outside, the first colors of dawn began to touch the horizon, pale rose and amber slipping through bare branches. Light crept across the snow, catching on drifts, illuminating the delicate crystals that clung to the edges of the cabin's roof. The world transformed from shadow to silver, then slowly to gold. Within, the family felt the change, even if they did not stop to admire it. They had work to do, and work itself was a kind of reverence. By the time the sun lifted fully above the tree line, the cabin was warmer, filled with the smell of cornmeal mush simmering on the stove, the sound of water pouring from kettle to cup, the sight of children rubbing sleep from their eyes. The ordinary morning had unfolded, step by gentle step, until what had been cold and uncertain now felt steady and alive. To us, looking back, these tasks might seem burdensome, hardship disguised as routine, but to those who lived them, they were grounding. They were evidence that life continued, that each small act carried the family one step further through the long season. There was no room for haste, no need for grandeur. The ordinary was enough. And so, ordinary morning tasks became rituals of care. They reminded each member of the family that they were part of something larger, something steady. They reminded them that, though the winter outside was vast and unforgiving, inside there was order, warmth, and belonging. In this way, the dawn was not only the rising of the sun, it was the rising of a household into another day of survival, stitched together by the soft rhythm of chores performed with patience, skill, and love. Routines stitched like quilt squares across time. Life on the frontier was not measured by clocks or schedules in the way we know them today. It was measured in habits, in patterns repeated so faithfully they became as natural as breathing. These routines were not dull. They were the stitches holding each day to the next, creating a patchwork of survival and memory. Like a quilt, each small square mattered less for its decoration and more for its place in the whole. Imagine a cabin in the quiet hours just after morning tasks were finished. The fire was built and stable, the kettle steamed. The children had eaten their first meal. Now the day stretched ahead, long and unbroken. Into that expanse came routine, giving shape to what might otherwise feel endless. The father might step outside to check the woodpile, counting with his eyes, estimating whether the stack would last another week. If the weather promised to stay clear, he would split more logs, though his hands ached from yesterday's labor. He moved with rhythm. Raise the axe, breathe, bring it down. Each strike echoed in the cold air, each log a reassurance. Inside, the mother worked with equal steadiness. A chair pulled near the light of the oiled paper window became her sewing place. Her needle slipped through cloth, mending shirts that had seen too many winters. The sound was soft but sure. The pricking of the needle, the tug of thread, the sigh of fabric drawn tight again. She mended as if she were stitching more than clothes. She was mending the very fabric of her family's protection. Children followed their own threads of routine. The eldest girl taught her younger siblings their letters on a small slate. Her voice was low, steady, never scolding. They practiced by the fire, chalk dust mixing with the faint smell of wood smoke. Their laughter, when it came, was not loud but contained, respectful of the household's rhythm. Even play carried boundaries in winter. As the hours passed, more tasks unfolded. Quilts were taken from beds and shaken out by the doorway. They caught the light, showing patterns faded by years of use. Squares of wool, strips of calico, patches cut from garments long outgrown. Each piece told a story. A square of blue from a grandfather's work shirt, a scrap of red from a mother's apron. The quilt was history made warm. To air it in the crisp winter air was to let memories breathe. There was also the tending of light. Lamps required trimming, their wicks cut and shaped, their glass chimneys wiped free of soot. A poorly trimmed wick smoked too much and wasted oil, too costly an error in a season when supplies might not be replaced for months. Children watched carefully, learning how the angle of a flame could mean the difference between steady glow and choking smoke. The family's routines were not only about chores, they were about order, the reassurance that nothing was forgotten. A day without rhythm could quickly unravel. Without practice, someone might forget to bank the fire, and the family could wake to cold ashes. Without care, snow might drift too high against the roof, creating dangerous ice. Routines prevented disaster. They created a kind of invisible shield against winter's threats. Evenings carried their own patterns. As dusk approached, the family shifted toward closing the day. Quilts were rehung over windows, tucked firmly to block drafts. Doors were checked twice, latches secured against the howl of wind. The indoor woodpile was replenished, so no one would need to venture outside during night's coldest hours. Then, the family gathered near the stove, their circle of light small, but sufficient. Sometimes the father read aloud from a worn Bible, his voice calm and even, the words falling into the quiet like drops of warm oil. Other nights, The mother told stories, memories of her own childhood winters, or tales she had heard from neighbors. These stories were not for entertainment alone. They reminded the children that they were part of a chain that others had endured, and so would they. There was comfort, too, in silence. A child might sit on the floor, whittling a stick into a small toy. Another might sketch letters again and again, practicing until chalk stained their fingers. The dog might shift near the hearth, sighing heavily as it curled closer. Each small act wove into the evening fabric, reinforcing the pattern: safety, warmth, togetherness. Outside, the night deepened. Stars emerged in their thousands, glittering through the thin air. The wind sighed against the cabin walls, testing for weaknesses. Snow creaked under its own weight. Yet inside, the family's routines held firm. These repeated acts were not merely habits. They were defenses, shields raised not with noise but with constancy. If you looked closely, you would see that these routines had artistry hidden within them. The way wood was stacked, not randomly, but with thought for airflow. The way quilts were layered, heaviest on the outside, softest near the skin. The way bread dough was set near, but not on the stove, rising from radiant heat alone. These were small arts, passed quietly from parent to child, never written down, but remembered in muscle and memory. Over time, routines became traditions, and traditions became memory. A child, grown old, would remember the smell of smoke in the morning, the sight of quilts hanging like banners of survival, the sound of a mother's needle pricking cloth. These were not dramatic memories, but they were enduring. They were the threads that stitched one generation to the next. And so, routine was not dull repetition. It was the steady heartbeat of life. Each stitch, each chore, each habit created a quilt of survival, patched together from ordinary acts. It was fragile, yes, but strong enough to last through the coldest nights. The hardest barriers arrive without sound. Not all struggles on the frontier were loud or visible. Some slipped into the cabin silently, like drafts that went unnoticed until fingers grew stiff, or like the gnawing of worry that made a mother stare into the fire longer than necessary. These were the silent obstacles, the challenges that did not roar like a storm or blaze like a fire, but crept in gently, settling themselves into daily life until one realized they were heavier than any snowfall. Cold itself was one such obstacle. Not the blizzard that screamed at windows, but the steady, unyielding chill that seeped into walls and floors, never leaving even when the stove burned hot. Families grew used to it, yet it remained, a presence that tested endurance. Children's feet touched icy floorboards each morning. Water froze again and again, no matter how often it was melted. Breath lingered in the air long after it was spoken. It was not deadly in the moment, but day after day it wore at body and spirit alike. Another obstacle was scarcity. Supplies carefully stored in autumn dwindled slowly, almost politely. A sack of flour grew lighter each week. A barrel of apples shriveled. Beans hardened until they took hours to soften in boiling water. The family rarely went hungry in a single night, but the creeping awareness of dwindling stores pressed at their minds. Mothers stretched recipes, fathers rationed portions, children grew skilled at ignoring their own small hunger. Scarcity was not a shout. It was a whisper that grew louder as the season wore on. Isolation, too, pressed in with quiet persistence. Neighbors who once waved across fields seemed impossibly far once the snow closed roads. A trip into town became a calculation of risk. Would the storm rise before the return? Would the horse falter in drifts? And so weeks passed without outside voices, without laughter shared beyond one's own walls. For some, this solitude was bearable. For others, it was a weight that pressed as hard as the snow on the cabin roof. Children felt obstacles differently. A draft was an adventure at first, a chance to stuff rags into cracks and play at sealing the fortress. But as days stretched long, boredom became its own quiet challenge. Toys were few, lessons repetitive. The same games played again lost their charm. Children grew restless, their energy trapped inside small rooms. Parents, though patient, carried the unspoken burden of keeping spirits steady, knowing that despair in a child could sour the whole household. Even relationships themselves carried obstacles. A sharp word spoken in weariness could linger for hours, heavy in the silence of close quarters. A disagreement about whether to burn another log or save it for tomorrow might feel larger than it was, yet these conflicts were seldom dramatic. They faded as quickly as they came, soothed by the shared necessity of survival. The real obstacle was not anger, but the quiet erosion of patience, tested again and again by proximity and repetition. And then there was fear, not dramatic, not shouted. A father stepping outside at dusk, glancing at the sky with unease. A mother waking in the night, listening for the crackle of flame, making sure the fire still lived. These fears were rarely spoken aloud, for words gave them power. Instead, they moved through the house like shadows, unacknowledged but deeply felt. Still, families endured. They recognized these silent obstacles for what they were, companions of winter, as natural as frost on the window. They met them not with defiance, but with patience. A mother sewed until her fingers ached, mending garments again and again, rather than surrendering to scarcity. A father whittled toys from scraps of wood, easing a child's boredom with the gift of something new. Children learned to help in small ways, giving shape to their long days by contributing to chores. The cabin itself seemed to join in the effort, each log pressed against the next, each seam of moss and clay guarding against drafts. The stove, old and blackened, gave what heat it could, its iron sides glowing faintly as though proud of its task. Even the quilts, layered and heavy, seemed to offer more than fabric. They offered reassurance, the feeling of being held. To live through such winters was to learn that obstacles need not roar to be powerful. The silent ones, the slow erosion of supplies, the steady pressure of cold, the weight of solitude, were just as testing. Yet they also taught resilience. They taught the art of stretching a little further, of noticing more closely, of valuing what was often overlooked. Picture a child sliding a rag into a crack at the window, his small fingers numb but determined. Picture a mother shaking the last scoop of flour from a sack, then smiling as she turns it into biscuits anyway. Picture a father, weary from chopping wood, still finding the strength to carve a little horse for his daughter. These small images are the answer to silent obstacles, quiet acts against quiet challenges, and so the family endured not by shouting down their hardships, but by meeting them in kind. Patience against cold, ingenuity against scarcity, tenderness against loneliness. A quilt of responses stitched with as much care as the quilts on their beds. When the night deepened and the wind sighed against the walls, those silent obstacles remained, but they no longer frightened. They were known, understood, even expected. And because they were faced together, they lost their sharpness. Quiet cracks reveal winter's steady hand. There comes a week each winter when the cold stops visiting and begins to move in. It settles its weight on the roof, presses a palm against the windows, and tests every joined edge of a house that seemed strong enough yesterday. Nothing announces itself with thunder. Instead, the season speaks in careful syllables. A soft tick in the stovepipe, a thin thread of air along the baseboard, a plank that lifts half a hair, then thinks better of it, and sighs flat again. The strains are modest, polite even, but persistent, like a letter slid under the door that asks to be read. In that week, the cabin takes on a tone you can hear if you grow quiet enough. Timbers murmur to one another as the frost tightens around them. Iron changes its voice when it cools. The stove pings in small, shy notes that carry across the room. Oiled paper at the window grows starry with ice, an entire night's work of delicate arithmetic. A wool sock stiffens on the drying line and hangs there in a thoughtful pose. Even bread, cut at breakfast, breaks not with a crumbly sigh, but with a brittle click. Winter, having entered without ceremony, begins to rearrange the furniture of the world by fractions. The family has learned to listen. The father rises at first light and holds a lit taper near seams where log meets log. The candle's flame leans, then stills. He marks each slight draft with a sliver of charcoal, tallying the house's small complaints. By the stove, the mother shakes flour into a bowl with a measured hand, hearing as much as seeing how the grain falls. Dry today, she thinks. The sack is cooler than yesterday. She adds a spoon of lard to coax tenderness from the dough, an adjustment as ordinary as tying an apron, but as consequential as turning a key. Children take their lessons wrapped in quilts at the table's edge. The eldest girl guides a small finger along a row of letters, while the boy glances toward the door latch, which has started humming when the wind turns from the north. Not a rattle precisely, more like a gossip, a low chattering under its breath. He wedges a folded strip of leather where wood meets iron, and the gossip grows thoughtful, then quiet. He sits again, and the letter A looks less like a ladder he must climb, and more like a roof that holds. Out at the woodshed, the father lifts an armful of split oak and pauses. The stack has crept 2 inches lower since yesterday. Not a problem today, not a crisis tomorrow, but a map of days to come. He measures without counting and returns to the yard, where the maul waits upright in the snow like a blunt mast. The ground answers each strike with a dense reply. Splinters come away sharp as new ideas. He picks up the wedges, traces the grain, and persuades the round to separate where it already intended to go. Winter doesn't like to be fought. It prefers to be negotiated with. Inside, the stove has its own treaties. The damper, content for weeks, begins to sulk. It opens too freely at first, then refuses the next invitation. The mother coaxes it with the poker's cool tip, the iron giving a small, reluctant nod. Smoke hesitates at the mouth and then decides to keep to its lane after all. The room clears. A child coughs once, mostly for effect, and receives a pat on the shoulder that says, "Without words, we are watching, we know." The cabin's corners make their feelings known in other ways. Clay chinking, straight-backed in October, now shows a fine hairline where the north wall meets the window frame. The crack is not a threat, only a confession. In a shallow bowl, the father mixes what the house understands. A scoop of creek clay kept in a crock behind the stove, a handful of sifted ash, a pinch of cut hair saved in summer. He works with 2 fingers, pressing the mixture into the thin seam until it smears smooth, like calming a frown from a child's brow. The draft withdraws, puzzled, and goes looking for mischief elsewhere. There is humor in these corrections, if you let it come. The door, for instance, has learned a winter trick. It swells on warm days, shrinks on cold ones, and now plays a quiet game with the latch. The game ends with a scrap of wool tacked under the strike plate and a muttered compliment from the father to the door's stubborn character. The mother, hearing this, smiles into the kettle. One earns one's jokes in January. On the second afternoon of that week, the sky turns a white with no depth in it, and the air becomes a fine powder in the lungs. This is the kind of day that asks a house to be a little better than it was. A slate of ice slips from the eaves without warning and lands in the yard with a sound like a folded book laid on a table. Everyone looks up, then down, then returns to work with a small shared breath. Later, the father steps out with the long rake, draws the burdened edge of the roof clean, and comes in with snow on his shoulders and a patch of roof scent, resin, cold wood, trace smoke, caught in his coat. A quieter shock comes at dusk. The stove has been kind all day, heat steady, draft willing. Then, a single pop from the stovepipe, a dry, hollow syllable, and a soot flake loosens and drifts down like black snow inside the pipe. The mother stirs the coals, tests the draw, and nods once. Not trouble yet, but a reminder. After supper, the father feeds the brush up the pipe from the clean-out, easing it along, listening for the soft hush of creosote surrendering. When he draws the brush back, a thin ribbon of black falls into the pail. The house breathes easier, which is to say, so does everyone in it. In small ways, strain comes to the body too. Needles, blunt faster. A thumb pricks blood into cloth, a star of red that the mother frowns at, then smiles away. A child's mitten wears thin at the palm from turning pages, of all things. A new patch is cut and sewn with a tidy ladder stitch. The boy, testing the mend, presses his palm to the stove's warm tile and says nothing, a private agreement with the patch. Rations accept their season as well. The lamp oil line creeps lower in the tin. Wick trimming becomes art, every quarter-inch a decision. The mother teaches the eldest girl to pinch the wick between two fingers and shape it to a gentle crescent. An even flame is less greedy, she says. The words land as instruction and blessing both. That night, the lamp burns steady, no smoke gathered in the chimney glass, and the room glows from one small wisdom. The floor finds its own winter. Heat rises, but the planks live close to the ground, and cold works there like a quiet mason. Rugs are rearranged by late afternoon, a quilt folded double where feet most often pass. The little one, set down after being carried too long, chirps at the shock, and then laughs as if cold were another household pet. The mother warms a stone by the stove, wraps it in cloth, and anchors the quilt with that weight. Practical kindness has a way of looking like grace. Out back, the pump handle stiffens. The father wraps it in burlap and ties it with baling twine in a sailor's knot he learned long ago. He works the handle with patient swings until water rises dark and decisive from the throat of iron. A swallow, colder than a promise but clean as one, and the bucket fills. Returning, he pauses at the threshold so his breath will clear from the scarf. He has learned to let the frost leavings fall outside instead of inside, where they melt and make slick work for boots. Night gathers with a care that would be tender if it were not also insistent. The wind begins its low reading of the valley, sounding the names of fences and hills. The house answers with its vocabulary: creak, whisper, settle, hush. At the table, lessons finish. The children stack slates, smooth crumbs from the wood, and sit in the circle of lamplight as the mother begins to mend a heel with her darning egg. The father trims the dowel that props the stove lid, not because it needs it, but because looking after small things keeps large worry in proportion. As the hour bends toward sleep, a final small shock pays its visit, not to frighten, but to teach. The oiled paper over the north window tightens under the sudden dip of temperature and gives a faint crackle, a spider-thin line racing across the frost. Everyone looks, no one speaks. The father is already standing, testing the frame with his palm, then fetching a strip of cloth and a tack. The repair takes as long as a prayer. He sits again. The room does not cool. The little one's eyelids flutter and drop. This is how winter shows its steady hand, not with ruin, but with rehearsal. A dozen minor demands, each worth answering, none worth anger. The family meets them with tools and patience, with humor where possible, and with silence where needed. In this, they discover that strain is not only a test, but a conversation. The house says, here, and they say, there, and strength becomes a kind of music you can only hear when you share it. Before bed, the father banks the fire with care 1 degree finer than last night. A large oak laid crosswise, a smaller ash along its shoulder, a veil of ash drawn over coals the way a mother draws a blanket over a sleeping child. The damper set just so. The door shut with that soft finality a cabin knows. Not a slam, not a click, but the sound of wood deciding to be with wood. They make a smaller room inside the room. Quilts are lifted, tucked, fastened at the corners to keep warmth from wandering. The eldest girl threads the sleepy dog under the table, where he will keep the floor from startling them with its cold if someone steps down in the night. The mother places the warmed stone at the foot of the bed, not touching skin, but close enough to be a word against shivering. She says goodnight without ceremony, and the word carries the weight of a well-tuned stove. Outside, an owl takes a slow inventory of the dark. Inside, breath becomes the one consistent weather. The cabin has accepted winter's terms for another day and answered them not with defiance, but with care. Strain remains, as it will, yet none of it rules the house. What rules are the small agreements, renewed gently, night after night. If a listener asked what saved them, the family might point to the stack of wood or the neat roll of rags or the jar of ash that waits for mixing. But the truer answer, the one you can only feel, is attention. The kind that notices a hinge before it squeals, a flame before it gutters, a child's quiet before it becomes worry. Attention is the warmest craft they know, and these quiet strains, oddly enough, are its teachers. Footprints in snow lead to a neighbor's door. The valley was never entirely silent in winter, though one might believe so at first glance. Sound traveled differently when the air itself was frozen. A hammer striking wood in one cabin might be heard like a faint bell a mile away. A shout to the animals in the barn echoed long, dissolving slowly in the frost. And sometimes, in that strange acoustics of deep cold, footsteps crunched so crisply they seemed to belong not only to the walker, but to the land itself. It was a morning when the Morrison family had just finished their plain breakfast of mush and coffee, the kind that offered more warmth than delight. The father, Thomas, stepped to the door, his coat already dusted with wood shavings from tending the pile. He meant only to test the sky, to feel which way the wind was leaning. Instead, he saw a line of tracks, sharp and unsoftened, leading from the tree line toward their own yard. The snow had fallen heavily the night before, and so these were fresh, edges still standing, crystals still catching the slant of dawn. They were boot prints, uneven but determined, the stride of someone not wandering, but intent on arriving. "Neighbor," he said over his shoulder, though his voice carried a note of caution. Neighbors were rare in weather like this. To cross through the waist-high drifts meant need, and need was seldom casual. The children came to the window, pressing their small hands against the frost-glazed glass. The prince seemed magical to them, as if a story had walked itself across the field. The eldest girl, Emma, traced one with her finger on the glass, whispering guesses about who it might be. The boy, John, squinted, counting the paces, imagining he could read the story of the walker's urgency in each step. At last the figure appeared, cresting the small rise that led from the ravine. It was Henry McClintock, hat pulled low, scarf stiff with frost, shoulders squared against the cold. He lifted a hand when he saw Thomas at the doorway. No words yet. Speech wasted in such air froze before it traveled. Only the arm raised in greeting, a line of breath drifting like smoke from his muffled mouth. Inside the cabin, the mother, Sarah, was already clearing space near the fire. She knew what a visitor meant. More mouths at the table, more warmth shared, and likely a story of difficulty carried with it. Hospitality on the frontier was not about choice. It was an obligation sewn as tightly into the fabric of life as any seam in a quilt. To turn away a neighbor in winter was to invite the same fate upon oneself someday. Henry stepped in at last, and the door closed quickly behind him, but not before the household felt the slash of cold air sweeping in. He stood by the threshold, snow falling from his boots in stiff chunks. His breath came fast, though he tried to steady it before speaking. "Morning," he said, voice raw. "I'd not have come, but—" He stopped, glancing at the children, then at Sarah's expectant face. He removed his hat, revealing hair pressed flat and rimed with frost. "We're short on wood. Stove near empty by dawn. I thought, perhaps Thomas could advise." The father nodded, saying nothing at first. He gestured toward the chair nearest the fire, though Henry shook his head and remained standing, as if unwilling to claim comfort he hadn't yet earned. Thomas looked into the firebox of his own stove, where oak logs burned with steady purpose. Then he turned back to Henry. "You brought no sled?" Henry shook his head. "Drifts too deep. I came on foot." The quiet that followed was heavier than the snow outside. Sarah broke it gently by lifting the kettle, pouring a measure of hot water into a tin cup, dropping in the last shaving of dried apple for flavor. "Drink," she said simply. Henry took the cup, his hands trembling not from cold now, but from a deeper weariness. He sipped, and the steam curled against his face, loosening the frost, caught in his lashes. Neighbors in such times were bound by an invisible cord. One man's shortage was not his alone. It threatened the valley's fabric. If Henry's stove went cold, his wife and children would suffer, and their suffering would echo outward, haunting every neighbor who might have helped. Thomas understood this, as did Sarah, as did even the children who watched in silence, sensing the weight of the moment. After a time, Thomas pulled on his heavy coat and motioned to John. "We'll walk back with you," he said. "See the state of it." Sarah did not protest, though her eyes tightened at the corners. She knew what such visits meant: labor, decisions, perhaps even sacrifice. Yet she only said, "Take bread with you. You'll need it." And so the three set out, retracing Henry's footprints through the snow. The drifts rose to their knees in places, and the cold bit at the skin wherever wool loosened its guard. Yet there was something steadying in following another's path. The prince gave shape to the blankness, a promise that others had already moved where you were moving now. The McClintock cabin came into view after half an hour. Smoke rose thin from the chimney, too thin for comfort. The walls looked unbanked, snow drifted unevenly against them. A door hung slightly ajar, warped by the damp, refusing to close tightly. Thomas frowned, his experienced eye noting each fault. Inside, the scene was worse. A stove glowing faintly, but not hot. Children wrapped in blankets near its mouth, eyes wide and pale. Martha, Henry's wife, looked up from her chair, her face etched with worry and sleeplessness. "We've done what we can," Henry said quickly, embarrassed by the state of things. "Wood won't last the week." Thomas moved to the stack near the wall, thin, damp, split to green. He tapped a piece with his knuckle. It rang with moisture. He looked back at Henry, who lowered his eyes. "Didn't season long enough?" Thomas said quietly, not with judgment, but with fact. No lecture was needed. Instead, Thomas rolled up his sleeves and began rearranging the stack, separating what might still burn from what would waste heat in smoke. John fetched an armful of smaller kindling from outside, where the driest scraps still lingered beneath the eaves. Soon the stove took on a new voice, sharper, more eager. Martha's shoulders eased as the flames rose, warmth returning in small but perceptible waves. And then Thomas spoke, his voice steady, his eyes on the fire. "We'll bring a sled tomorrow, share from our stack. But you must learn what this stove asks of you. It's not just wood. It's the right wood, the right cut, the right time. You keep it wrong, it'll punish you." Henry nodded, his pride pricked but not destroyed. He glanced at his children, then at Martha, and swallowed hard. "I'll learn." The visit lasted an hour. In that time, Thomas showed Henry how to bank snow properly against the north wall, how to check drafts with a taper, how to arrange wood for a coal bed that would last till morning. None of this was new to Thomas. He had practiced it daily for years. But to Henry, each act was revelation. John watched closely, not only learning, but noticing the look in Martha's eyes, a look of gratitude so deep it made words unnecessary. When they left, the stove glowed brighter, the cabin held its heat more willingly, and the family inside seemed steadier. The return walk was hard, the wind sharp now, but the footprints guided them back, their own joining the earlier line until it was no longer clear who had led and who had followed. That was the nature of neighbors. One path, shared. Back in their own cabin, Sarah greeted them with relief. The bread was sliced, steam curling from the crust as if to remind them that nourishment could be simple. Thomas said little, but his silence was heavy with thought. John, sitting near the stove, felt a new kind of tiredness, one not from chopping or hauling, but from understanding, the weight of knowing that survival was never solitary, and that a neighbor's weakness was always, in some measure, your own. Quiet strength lies in places rarely seen. There were times, during the long depth of January, when the Morrison family seemed to draw warmth not only from the stove, but from hidden wells of strength they themselves hardly knew they possessed. These reserves were not stored in barrels or stacked in the woodshed. They were tucked in the folds of habit, patience, and the small mercies offered one to another when days blurred into sameness. In the dim blue of early morning, before the sun had yet bothered to rise above the ridge, Sarah often rose first. She lit the candle with careful hands, shielding the flame from drafts. It was not just firelight she sought. It was a way of waking the house gently, of saying to her family that the day might be cold, but it would not be cruel. This simple act, repeated morning after morning, became one of those hidden reserves. The children grew to trust that they would open their eyes to a world not entirely dark, and in that trust lay strength. Thomas, too, had his quiet store of endurance. He moved through each day as though carrying a ledger in his head, balancing the sums of labor and rest, of wood taken from the stack and wood returned. He never spoke of his calculations, but they governed his choices. When he left 2 logs by the stove instead of 3, when he waited an hour longer to fetch more water, it was not stinginess, but foresight. The family did not see the reserve he kept in his mind, but they lived within its safety all the same. Children discovered reserves of another sort. Emma, scarcely 15, bore herself with a steadiness beyond her years. When little Michael grew restless, she invented games with buttons and scraps of cloth, weaving stories from the barest materials. When William complained of cold toes, she guided his small feet near the warmed stones, wrapping them again with quilt scraps. Her patience was not endless, but it stretched further than even she expected. It was a hidden reserve, drawn upon each day, replenished only by the knowledge that her care was noticed, if not always spoken. John, at 12, learned his own kind of strength in the woodshed. The axe was heavy, its handle slick with frost. More than once the log slipped, or the blade stuck stubbornly, refusing to split. He felt frustration rise, sharp and hot. Yet each time he steadied himself, adjusted his grip, tried again. What he built in those moments was not merely a pile of firewood, but a reserve of persistence that would serve him long after the snow melted. The family did not praise him often. Words were conserved as carefully as supplies, but his father's rare nod was enough to show that hidden strength had been seen. Even the cabin itself seemed to hold reserves, as though it knew the family's need. Walls thickened with snowbanks grew more silent each day, their seams pressed tighter by the cold. The sod roof, heavy and still, shed the wind as if it were nothing more than a passing hand. The quilts, patched and worn, seemed to find new warmth as the weeks dragged on, each layer holding memory as much as heat. These, too, were reserves, not just materials, but the echo of summers past, of labor already spent and stored like sunlight in cloth. Scarcity had a way of teaching discovery. When lamp oil ran low, Sarah remembered the old trick of trimming wicks to a crescent, shaping the flame to burn cleaner, longer. The children thought it magic. She only smiled and said it was something her own mother had known. When the flour barrel echoed with emptiness, she pulled cornmeal from a cloth sack, stretching meals with recipes half remembered from her girlhood. Such knowledge, tucked away like seeds in winter, revealed itself only when needed. That was the very definition of hidden reserve. There were reserves, too, in silence. The family spoke less as the winter deepened, not from coldness of heart, but from conservation. Words, like firewood, were used where they mattered. A father's brief instruction, a mother's humming while she sewed, a child's soft laugh at the dog's antics. These sounds carried more weight precisely because they were rare. In silence, they found rest from the constant demand of vigilance. Quiet was not emptiness. It was a storehouse of calm. One evening, as the wind rattled branches outside and the stove's glow pulsed steadily, Sarah brought out a small pouch from her chest. Inside were herbs gathered last summer, dried mint, chamomile, a handful of rose hips. She steeped them in hot water, and the fragrance lifted through the cabin like a gentle reminder that summer had not vanished, only slept. The children sipped from tin cups, their faces softening in the steam. This was no medicine of necessity. It was a reserve of comfort, a balm for spirits as important as warmth for the body. And when the storm pressed hardest, when the fire sputtered low, or a draft cut cold across the floor, Thomas sometimes told a story. Not long, not fanciful, but simple memories of his boyhood. A hunt with his father, a barn raising, the first time he saw snow reach the height of a fence. The children listened with eyes wide, forgetting for a moment the present cold. In those stories lay another reserve, not of supplies, but of hope, that winters had been survived before and would be again. Reserves did not mean abundance. They were not endless. Each act of patience, each remembered trick, each quiet comfort cost something. Yet they replenished themselves in ways visible only when tested. The family learned to trust not only the woodpile in the pantry, but their own ability to endure, to create warmth from within when the world outside offered none. The cabin grew dim as the lamp was lowered that night, its flame trimmed close to the wick. Outside, the wind traced patterns across the snow, erasing the day's tracks until all was smooth again. Inside, the family curled together beneath quilts, warmed by stones, by stories, by the steady knowledge that even in scarcity, reserves remained, hidden, yes, but present, waiting to be drawn upon when most needed. Little kindnesses turn frost into comfort. Winter has a way of making the smallest good deed feel large, as if each gentle act were a lamp set on a far ridge. In the Morrison cabin, kindness rarely announced itself. It moved like warm air, quiet and certain, filling the corners no fire ever reached. Before dawn, Sarah slipped from bed and set a stone on the stove's back iron, not for herself, but for the little ones whose feet always seemed to find the coldest plank on the floor. She did not say, "I am doing this for you." She simply wrapped the heated stone in a bit of worn flannel and tucked it at the foot of the children's bed, where toes would find it as naturally as birds find morning light. The cabin stayed hushed. The small favor went to work. Thomas had a similar habit with the wood. He kept a narrow bundle of perfect kindling under the bench, splinters dry as paper, arranged with the neat minds of letters in a school book. It was never used when the fire was easy to start. It was held back, always, for the day it wasn't. He would say nothing about the stash, even when he reached for it, but everyone knew. Every house needs a secret reserve of mercy. Emma practiced her quiet gifts where the light fell best, by the oiled paper window, where midday made a pale square on the table. Her needle and thread traveled the same seams over and over, a mitten palm that wore thin too soon, a sleeve that always caught on the latch, the corner of a quilt that seemed determined to fray. She chose her patches carefully, not for color, but for memory. A coin of blue from the shirt Thomas wore when Catherine first stood. A strip of florals from a dress Sarah had turned twice before. A tough wool from a coat that had belonged to Emma's grandmother. The children slept under a history they could touch. John had learned another kind of kindness, one that began with attention. He watched how the stovepipe collected a feathery bloom of soot just below the elbow. He saw where frost webbed the north window, always in the same corner. He kept a thin stick and a rag by the pipe, a needle of clay by the window frame. When the world tried to creep in, he met it with small corrections. He took no credit. He simply liked the feeling of a right-sized problem answered with an exactly sized fix. Even William and Michael, their hands always looking for something to hold, had their share. William learned to warm a spoon in his fist before handing it to the baby, so the metal wouldn't sting her lips. Michael, who doted on the dog, tucked a scrap of quilt beneath Buck's chest when the floor was cruel with cold. Buck took this with the dignity of a grateful uncle and thumped his tail exactly once, as if to say, "Yes, that's the place." There were neighborly kindnesses that traveled without names. One gray morning, When the sky held snow in a low, heavy thought, Thomas rose earlier than habit and bound a small bundle of kindling with twine. He set it on the hidden side of the McClintock's stoop. No knock, no word. Then turned back along his own footprints before the wind had a chance to erase them. Later, when Henry found the bundle, he said nothing either, only stacked it by the stove and looked at his hands for a long time, as if examining where gratitude should be kept. Sarah baked when she could. Flour had thinned to a whisper at the bottom of the sack, but cornmeal could be persuaded to generosity with a little molasses and a pinch of salt. She cut the mush firm, toasted it on the stove in a cast-iron skillet, and brushed the edges with bacon drippings saved in a tin. The scent went about the room like a kind rumor. She kept a piece aside, wrapped in a rag, and later tucked it into Emma's pocket with a glance that said, "When you take those mended mittens to Martha, give her this, but don't make talk of it." Kindness made a music of the house. The ladle traced slow circles in a pot. The dog's sigh timed itself to the stove's expansions. The water pail, brought closer to the heat for the old one's hands, creaked as ice considered melting and decided to oblige. Each sound took up the next, a quiet relay. And then, as winter likes to do, a small shock. The lamp chimney gave a hairline crack with a sound like a fingernail on glass. It didn't fail entirely. It simply confessed. The flame contracted to a fussy blue, and smoke smudged the top of the chimney where the soot never quite reached. No one gasped. Thomas stood the lamp on the table, turned the wick down to a safe whisper, and looked at the damage with a sort of courtly respect, as though the glass had served nobly and deserved a careful farewell. "In the chest," Sarah said, soft. She meant the wire and the thin cotton tape. Thomas eased the warm chimney free with a cloth, breathed once into his hands to steady them, and wrapped a thin loop of wire around the fracture, then another, the way a careful man might bandage a sapling in a high wind. Sarah cut a slim collar from an old shirt cuff, dampened it, and seated it gently at the chimney's mouth where the crack began. Emma polished the glass with a scrap of flour sack until it shone like a winter moon. When Thomas set it back and trimmed the wick to a crescent, the flame rose clean and polite, as if grateful. The room brightened, not just with light, but with the feeling that trouble had been answered with tenderness. Later, another small jolt, the kind that arrives with a gust. The door blew wide on a wayward gust and threw a ribbon of snow across the floor. William startled and then laughed, seeing the way the flakes skittered like quick fish. Thomas did not scold the door. He lifted the latch plate, set a folded scrap of leather behind it, and drove a tack with the hammer he kept hanging on a nail within reach of his right hand. "You and I," he told the door, "must keep our agreements." The door, having been spoken to kindly, shut itself with a modest pride. Kindness made a practice of the water, too. John began turning the buckets a quarter circle every evening, so the same spot would not always freeze against the same plank. It was a small thing, evidence of a mind that pays attention. The ice broke easier in the morning, and the kettle boiled sooner, and the day, started on a saving, seemed to spend itself more wisely. When the cold bit particularly hard, Sarah set a mug on the stove's edge, empty but warming, and when Emma returned with wind in her hair and a neat patch of pink in her cheeks from the walk to Martha's, there was already a place for her hands to belong. The cup received water and a sprig of last summer's mint, with the ceremony due to such arrivals. Emma held the tin in both palms, letting the heat move into her bones, as if heat were a memory that could be recalled. On the third evening of that week, the stew grew thin. not in flavor. It was rich with onion and a corner of salt pork, but thin in number. Sarah looked at the pot, then at the circle of bowls. She did not sigh. She lifted the ladle as if it were a baton and conducted the miracle of enough. A spoonful more hot water, a longer simmer, a quick rub of thyme between her fingers to wake it summer. The stew thickened again, not by addition, but by attention. The bowls filled to their modest brims. Moments like that are why families trust kitchens more than miracles. There were small jokes that belonged to winter and therefore to kindness. The dog learned to station himself exactly where a careless elbow might knock a crumb from bread to floor. Thomas, from long practice, managed to miss by exactly enough to keep Buck believing in Providence. William and Michael, who had been told not to feed the dog at the table, studied their father with the reverent awe reserved for men who can break a rule without anyone being the poorer for it. At night, when the lamp's flame was pinched to a seed and the stove breathed in measured sleep, the family's last kindnesses were made of placement. The warmed stones were moved to the right beds. The kettle, half full, was drawn to the warm ring, but not the hottest. The poker was set where a hand could find it without searching. Sarah, last to lie down, stepped lightly to the corner, where a persistent draft liked to seek its old path, and pressed her palm a moment to the patched seam, as if reminding it of its promise. There was a visit, short and simple, that served as a lesson in the kind of mercy winter understands. Martha sent a note tucked under Emma's patch, 3 words in a tidy hand. More careful now. It came with a small return, 3 dried apples wrapped in brown paper. The apples were not many. They were exactly right. The paper itself would find a second life as tinder on a morning when the kindling forgot to be generous. Nothing in winter lacks a next purpose. Children learn to carry kindness without announcement. John, tracing letters with Michael, turned the slate to set the younger boy's hand in the best light. He did it without remark, and Michael, not knowing to say thanks, simply wrote better. Emma lifted the corner of a quilt when Catherine burrowed too deep and left a finger's width of cool air so the baby wouldn't sweat and chill. These favors were so small that if you measured them against a blizzard, they would disappear. Yet measured against the heart, they made weather. Sometimes a kindness is to speak plainly. When Henry came again, hat in hand and worry tighter than pride, Thomas did not scold. He told him exactly how many days of wood he could expect from the stack he had, given the week's wind. He did the arithmetic aloud, slowly enough that the numbers could be kept, and then he pressed a wedge into Henry's hand and said, "Split along the light." He meant the seam in the log where the grain offers itself. He also meant everything else. The house kept count in a way no ledger can. After supper, laughter lived in the room for half a minute longer than the night before. The dog slept on his side, belly to the glow, trusting the fire so completely he showed it his heart. The wind found the chink less often. The lamp burned clear to the bottom of its hour. These were the returns on small, frequent offerings. A final jolt, hardly worth the word, but worth the lesson. The broom's handle split near the ferrule, a tired crack that would turn to break with the next hard sweep. Thomas ran a thin saw cut up the grain, worked a sliver of pine in as a spline, bound it with waxed thread, and warmed the joint above the stove until the resin found its hold. When Sarah took it up again, the broom felt truer, in her hand, as if repaired things could be more themselves than when they were new. Perhaps they can. Late, with the fields spread in white and the sky ringing with stars, the family found themselves listening to nothing in particular and liking it. Silence, warmed by kindness, is not empty. It is full of past favors and future ones, of the sure knowledge that while winter will not shorten itself for anyone, it will sit a little farther from the door if you feed it decency. Old memories become blankets against the chill. Memory has a way of glowing warmer in winter, as though the cold itself summons it closer. In the Morrison cabin, where hours sometimes stretched as long as shadows, memory was not just idle thought. It was fuel, different from wood or coal, but just as necessary. Each story told, each recollection pulled from the past, was another kind of fire, one that asked no log pile, no draft of air. It often began in the quiet after supper, when the bowls had been scraped and set aside, and the kettle sang softly on the stove. The children, gathered in their quilts, would glance toward their father or mother with a look that needed no words. "Tell us," the look said. "Bring us somewhere beyond the wind." And often Thomas would clear his throat, shift in his chair, and begin. He might recall his boyhood in Pennsylvania, where winters were kinder but seemed harsher to a child's skin. He remembered a sled fashioned from barrel staves, the thrill of sliding down hills that, in truth, were hardly slopes at all. He remembered his mother's bread, rising in the warm corner of a hearth, and how a boy could believe nothing in the world smelled better. The children listened wide-eyed, as if the scent might drift across decades into their small cabin. Sarah had her own treasury. She spoke of her girlhood kitchen, where her mother kept crocks of pickles lined neatly along the shelf. She described the feel of fresh laundry hung on a line in March, stiff with ice, and the pride of bringing it in, thawed and fragrant with sun. She told of the neighbors who came calling on Sundays, of hymn singing that lifted walls higher than their logs suggested. To the children, it was as though a second cabin existed, larger, brighter, always warm with company. Emma listened closely, her hands busy with needle and thread. She was old enough to understand that these memories were not just stories, but lessons. How to keep a house, how to notice small joys, how to endure. John, meanwhile, studied his father's face, watching how his eyes softened when he spoke of his own father, how his voice slowed when describing the work of splitting rails or tending stock. Memory was not only what was said, it was how it changed the teller. Sometimes memory came by surprise. One evening, while mending a sleeve, Sarah paused, needle midair. She smiled faintly and said, "My grandmother always used goose quills to baste seams. Said they slid smoother than any needle. She laughed, low and warm. She'd keep a bundle in the cupboard, trimmed sharp as thorns. I can see them still." For a moment, the cabin seemed to hold not just the Morrisons, but generations layered within its walls, each leaving some tool, some habit, some trace. The children, too, made their own small memories, though they did not know it. The simple act of gathering snow in buckets, the feel of steam on their faces as it melted into water, the scent of wood smoke caught in wool scarves. These were impressions that would remain. Someday, in a warmer house, they would speak of it. Remember when we melted snow for every cup? Memory was being written even as it was recalled. Neighbors' tales joined the circle in absentia. Thomas spoke of old Jim Barker, the trapper who taught him to bank fires at night. He told of the Henderson barn raising, where every family brought food until the table bent under pies and roasts. Sarah recalled a woman who stitched quilts from flour sacks, turning the plainest cloth into works of comfort. The children heard these names as legends, as figures who belonged to their own survival, though they might never meet them. There was comfort, too, in the stories of hardship survived. Thomas remembered the winter of '78, when a cow froze in its stall and men dug through drifts higher than fences to reach neighbors. He described the sting of loss, but also the way people shared what they had left. Flour, bacon, firewood. These echoes were sobering, yet they also carried reassurance. Others had faced worse and lived to tell it. Memory softened the hours when work was done. It reminded the family that their struggle was not solitary, but a chapter in a much longer book. It wove threads from past to present, tying children to parents, parents to grandparents, all bound in a fabric of endurance. The past was not gone. It lingered in the very way the fire was banked, the bread kneaded, the windows covered. And in those moments when the lamp flame trembled and the wind pressed close, memory did something remarkable. It eased fear. A remembered laugh, a mother's hands kneading dough, a father's whistle in the field. These came back not as shadows, but as warmth. It was as if the dead themselves lent their strength, whispering through remembered gestures, "You are not alone." One night, as snow thickened against the walls, little William asked, "Papa, when I'm grown, will I tell my children about this winter?" Thomas looked at him steadily, the corners of his mouth softening. "Yes, son, you will. And when you do, it won't seem so hard. You'll remember the warmth and the stories and the way we kept each other." Sarah reached for William's hand, and in that simple joining was the answer. Memory itself was the shelter, as strong as any roof. Night watches carried more than fire's glow. When the sun dipped low and the cabin surrendered to its shadows, the Morrison family knew that the true test of winter was not the storm or the frost, but the night. Darkness on the frontier was not merely absence of light. It was a presence, a companion that pressed close against the walls, whispered through the eaves, and tested the patience of anyone who dared to sit awake through its long hours. The family shared the duty of keeping the night, though Thomas often bore the heaviest share. He knew that a fire untended could die in the space of an hour, and that a cabin left to the mercy of the cold could harden into a tomb before dawn. Yet he also knew that the watch was more than fire tending. It was listening. It was guarding against a silence too complete. It was standing between his sleeping family and whatever lay beyond the thin barrier of wood and moss. On his watch, Thomas would sit close to the stove, the poker resting near his knee, the lamp trimmed to a soft cone of light. The steady tick of expansion in the stove's iron was as much a reassurance as his wife's breathing from across the room. Every so often, he would rise, move to the door, and place his palm against the seam. Was there a draft sneaking through? Did the latch hold? He touched the logs of the wall, felt for any tremor of cold air where the chinking might have shrunk. His hands became instruments as precise as any tool. Sarah took her watch differently. She wrapped herself in her shawl, settled by the stove, and turned her thoughts to prayer or quiet song. She hummed tunes from her girlhood church, so softly that even the dog lifted an ear, as though uncertain if he heard them. Sometimes she held the baby against her chest, rocking gently while the fire muttered in its box. To Sarah, the watch was not only defense against cold, but a time of keeping spirits whole. She imagined her voice weaving through the walls, joining the night, saying, "You may rage outside, but within we are steadfast." Emma, when her turn came, carried a determination far beyond her years. She set her chair at an angle where she could see both the stove's glow and the outlines of her younger brothers. Her eyes grew heavy, but she forced herself awake by mending small seams or turning over the pages of an old almanac they kept. She read aloud, not for meaning, but for sound, as though words themselves were companions in the dim hours. When she added wood, she took her time, remembering how her father angled each log for airflow. She imitated his movements, as much to learn as to keep the fire alive. John's turn at the watch was the most eager, though his youth made it harder. He treated it as an honor, a sign that he was nearly a man. At first, he would sit upright, his back stiff with pride, eyes darting to every shadow. He watched the stove like a sentinel, waiting for the exact moment when the coals sighed low enough to need tending. But inevitably, his eyelids would droop, and he would jerk awake, ashamed. His father told him gently that even soldiers slept during their posts if they could find a safe moment. The trick, Thomas said, is to know the difference between rest and neglect. The children's watches were rare, but each taught them the weight of responsibility. They learned that warmth came not only from what the fire gave, but from the hands that fed it in the dark. They began to see night not as an enemy, but as a partner, demanding attention in exchange for safe passage. The house itself seemed to keep watch in its own way. The wind probed at the shutters, seeking gaps, but the quilts held firm. The roof creaked as ice shifted, but it shed its load. Snow pressed close along the outer walls, muffling the night like a blanket. The cabin, too, stood sentinel, shaped by human hands to shield its makers from what no man or woman could face alone. There were moments, though, when the watch revealed its dangers. Once, near midnight, a sound carried through the wind, a sharp crack, like timber splintering. Thomas froze, listening. Was it a tree breaking under ice? A beast moving through the drifts? He waited, heart steady but alert. Then came another sound, softer, the cry of wolves, distant but clear. The dog lifted his head, growled low. Thomas fed the fire and kept his hand near the poker, though he knew wolves seldom braved the light of cabins. Still, in that moment, he felt the thinness of their walls, the fragility of their warmth. Another night, when Sarah watched, she noticed the lamp flame gutter strangely. She rose, checked the chimney, and found soot had thickened quicker than expected. Had she ignored it, smoke might have curled into the room, choking sleepers. With quiet resolve, she cleaned it, trimmed the wick anew, and whispered thanks for noticing in time. The watch demanded not only endurance, but constant awareness of small changes. In the longest nights, those when storms pressed for days and time itself seemed stalled, the watches blurred into one another. The family learned to share the hours not as burdens, but as links in a chain. One kept the fire, the next carried it forward, the next delivered it to dawn. When at last morning came, pale and uncertain through the oiled paper window, it was not just the sun they greeted. It was each other, still safe, still warm, thanks to the unseen hours one had given for all. Night watch taught a lesson deeper than any sermon. Survival was not a matter of strength alone. It was vigilance, patience, and trust. It was knowing that while one pair of eyes closed, another stayed open. It was proof that families endured not by accident, but by constant tending, of fire, of walls, of one another. And so the watch went on, night after night, through the grinding heart of winter. The cabin glowed faintly in the blackness, a lantern of life in a wilderness that might otherwise have swallowed them whole. Inside, the Morrisons breathed steady, one wakeful soul always keeping guard. A storm can teach the meaning of waiting. The sky did not warn them with thunder or unlightning. It began with stillness, a kind of pause in the air, as if the valley itself were drawing breath. The animals shifted uneasily, The dog paced the floorboards, and Thomas stepped outside to study the horizon. By the time he came back in, snow was already falling. Not in flakes that danced, but in sheets that swallowed distance. The family knew at once this was no passing squall. This was the sort of storm that tested patience as much as strength. When the first winds arrived, the cabin groaned like a ship in heavy seas. Snow drove sideways against the logs, packing into every crevice, piling against the door. Thomas shoved the latch bar into place and nodded to Sarah, who was already gathering quilts for the windows. Emma moved to cover the baby, while John darted to the woodpile. The children watched the adults without fear, but with the solemn understanding that something larger than themselves had begun. The hours stretched, wind screamed, then fell silent, then rose again with renewed force. It rattled the shutters, whistled through nail holes, tried every seam for weakness. The stove became the family's anchor, its iron sides glowing, its coals nurtured with care. The room nearest it grew warm enough to loosen stiff fingers, but only steps away the air was sharp as knives. The family drew close, the storm pressing them inward like hands folding around a flame. Meals became quiet rituals. Sarah ladled cornmeal mush into bowls, the steam curling upward as though eager to join the warmth. Salt pork, sparingly sliced, lent its savor to broths that stretched farther than seemed possible. Each bite carried weight, not only for hunger's sake, but because it reminded them that provisions were holding. As the storm raged, even modest food became a declaration. We are not undone. Days merged into one another. Outside, the world disappeared. No tree, no fence, no sky, only a blind whiteness, endless and near. Inside, life bent itself to patience. Emma taught William and Michael letters on the slate board, her chalk moving with deliberate care. John sharpened tools, oiling handles, smoothing nicks from the saw with slow strokes of file. Thomas mended harness straps, the sound of awl through leather marking time. Sarah spun wool, her foot steady on the treadle, the hum of the wheel blending with the wind. At night, the blizzard pressed even harder. The house shuddered, snow sifted through the tiniest cracks, and ice built thick along the window's inner edges. Yet the family answered with quiet ingenuity. They banked hot stones at the bed's foot, laid extra quilts across the little ones, shifted the table to block drafts. They built their own storm within the cabin, one of warmth, resilience, and quiet endurance. The strain showed in small ways. The dog, restless, whined at the door, though he had no wish to leave. The children grew short with one another, their games collapsing into quarrels. Even Sarah's hands, steady as seasons, trembled once when the lamp chimney smoked. But each time, someone answered with patience. A gentle word, a quiet smile, a hand laid softly across a shoulder. The blizzard was fierce, but it could not cross the threshold of kindness. Thomas spoke little, but when he did, his words carried weight. Storms don't last forever, he said, though outside it seemed otherwise. Snow comes heavy, but it cannot stay heavy. It has to settle. It has to rest. The children clung to this as if it were a promise, repeating it in whispers as they lay beneath their quilts. By the third day, supplies felt tighter, though still sufficient. Sarah measured flour with a careful hand, stretching it with cornmeal and imagination. Water, melted from snow, tasted faintly of smoke from the stove, but no one complained. The fire burned steady, its light a constant reassurance that life continued, that hours were not wasted, but endured. On the fourth day, the wind dropped. The silence was startling, so sudden, so deep, it seemed unnatural. The children tiptoed, as though afraid sound might call the storm back. Thomas eased the door open, pushing against a drift nearly as high as his shoulder. The world outside was unrecognizable. Trees stood like statues carved in white. The barn was half buried. Paths were gone. Yet the air was still, the snow settling, the storm's patience finally spent. The family stepped carefully into the brightness, squinting against the glare. The cold bit, but the stillness offered peace. They stood together, their breaths pluming in the pale light, marveling at how silence after fury can feel like music. Behind them, the cabin glowed faintly with its smoke, proof that through all the storm's persistence, one small hearth had endured. Inside, Sarah whispered what all of them felt. "We waited, and we are still here." The blizzard had demanded patience, and the family had answered with it. Not in great declarations, but in each small act of tending fire, mending cloth, sharing food, and bearing hours without complaint. The storm had ended, but the memory of waiting together would last, woven into their survival as surely as logs into the walls. Kindness traveled across frozen miles. In the valley, cabins stood far apart, scattered like islands in a white sea. Between them lay distances that in summer could be crossed with ease, a mile, maybe two. But in winter, when drifts rose to a man's chest and the wind erased paths overnight, those same distances became oceans of peril. And yet, despite the danger, neighbors mattered most in the months when the world seemed intent on shrinking. For the Morrisons, the nearest family lay just over a mile to the east, the McClintocks, who had come to Montana only a year before. Thomas had watched them raise their cabin late that spring, their cuts rough, their chinking thin, their woodpile smaller than wisdom allowed. He had spoken a few warnings, gentle but firm, yet pride kept Henry McClintock smiling as if effort alone would hold back the cold. Thomas knew better. Effort mattered, yes, but knowledge, preparation, and the steady patience of habit mattered more. When the great storm ended and silence settled, Thomas looked at his wife across the breakfast table. "We'll need to check on them," he said simply. Sarah nodded, though her eyes betrayed worry. The storm had raged 4 days. If the McClintocks had not managed their fire, their cabin might be no warmer than the snow outside. John went with his father, bundled in layers so heavy he could barely bend his knees. The snow squeaked under their boots, a sound that only came when the air was colder than breath should dare. Each step was labor, each drift an obstacle. Yet they pressed on, the boy learning the rhythm of travel in deep cold. Steady pace, shallow breaths, conserve energy. At last, the McClintock place came into view, and even from a distance, Thomas saw signs of trouble. The chimney's smoke was thin, too pale for proper burning. No paths led to the barn or the woodpile. Snow lay untouched before the door, as though no one had braved it in days. He called out from 30 yards, his voice carrying over the silence. Only after the second shout did the door creak open and Henry's face appeared, drawn, hollow, red, with the raw heat of sitting too near the stove. Inside, the picture was plain. Bedding had been dragged to the stove where scraps of furniture fed the weak fire. Martha sat bundled with the children, their eyes wide, cheeks pale. Pride could not hide fear. "We've been burning what we could find," Henry admitted, his voice thin. "Didn't think the storm would last so long." Thomas said little, only set to work. He adjusted the damper, showed Henry how to angle logs so that coals, not flames, carried the heat. He stepped outside, shoveled a path to the root cellar, and showed John how to bank snow against the walls for insulation. "Every handful counts," he said quietly. Inside again, he taught Martha the trick of heated stones wrapped in rags for the children's beds, and Sarah's recipe for stretching flour with cornmeal. Knowledge was as precious as firewood, and he gave it freely, for survival was no place for stinginess. The children watched Martha's eyes. She absorbed each word, each gesture, as though she knew her family's very breath depended on it. And perhaps it did. John, though young, recognized it too, that sometimes it was the women who carried lessons most faithfully, who turned instruction into practice, who stitched survival into the daily fabric of life. When they left, Henry pressed a small loaf of bread into Thomas's hand. "The last of our flour," he said, his voice thick with shame and gratitude. Thomas shook his head. "Keep it," he replied. But Henry insisted. In the end, they accepted it not as food, but as a sign, a gesture that said neighbors, even desperate ones, could still offer something back. The walk home was slower. Snow weighed heavy on their boots, and the wind had picked up again, though not with the fury of the storm. As they trudged side by side, John asked, "Will they make it, Papa?" Thomas considered a long while before answering, "They will now. Not because they're strong, but because they're learning." The boy nodded, tucking that truth into memory like a coal into ash. Back at the Morrison cabin, Sarah listened carefully as Thomas described what he'd seen. She did not judge the McClintocks. She only said, "They'll need checking again." It was not suspicion, but compassion speaking. Compassion that knew survival was a long season, not a single storm. Neighbors meant more than proximity. They were reminders that no family stood alone, even when snow lay between like an ocean. The Hendersons to the north, the Pattersons to the west. Each cabin bore its own battle against cold, but all were tied together by invisible threads. A knock at the door in January might mean help or warning or simple fellowship, and in a land where silence reigned too heavy, even a single voice carried across snow could feel like salvation. For the Morrisons, that winter etched the truth deeper than ever. That kindness traveled slowly across the drifts, but it traveled surely, and when it arrived, whether in the form of advice, a shared loaf, or a helping hand with snowbanks, it warmed more than the stove ever could. Every tool held more than simple purpose. Long before the storms came, even before the leaves fell from the trees, Thomas Morrison had walked the woodlot with care. In his mind, he counted not only logs for the stove, but also the quiet companions that would see his family through the bitter months. Tools, worn smooth by use, resting in their rightful places. Each had a voice, if one listened, a way of telling its history through the wear of wood, the shine of steel, or the nick of a blade long ago dulled and sharpened again. In the lean-to beside the cabin, the saws rested, cross-cut, two-man, their blades long as a child, their teeth set at just the right angle to bite without binding. When John first learned to hold one, he marveled at how it seemed to pull itself forward if handled gently. His father's lesson was simple. Don't fight it. Let it do the work. Steel knows its own path. Many evenings, Thomas sat by the lamp filing those teeth, each stroke measured, each spark a reminder that sharpness was a matter of life. The axes hung on pegs driven into the wall, broad axe for felling, smaller hand axe for kindling, splitting maul for when oak rounds stood stubborn. Their handles, rubbed with oil until they gleamed in the lamplight, fit like extensions of the hand. Thomas showed John where to strike, along the grain, never across. He taught him to read the wood's hidden lines, the way a log would tell you where it wanted to part if you studied it patiently. Splitting was less about force than about listening. There was the draw knife, too, its curved blade used to shape logs, to smooth handles, to fashion sled runners. Emma remembered sitting near her father one summer as he worked it, curls of wood falling at his feet, the smell sharp and sweet. She had asked him then if the knife could make anything. He smiled, shook his head. It can only shape what's already there. You have to see it first. She carried that answer with her, perhaps sensing even then that survival was as much about vision as about strength. Smaller tools filled boxes, awls for leather, needles for sailcloth patches, files, wedges, hammers. Each was checked, repaired, stored in its place. When winter pressed close and days blurred together, these tools were touched daily. A broken strap needed mending, a hinge needed tightening, a sled runner needed smoothing. Their rhythm became part of the household, scrape of file, tap of hammer, hiss of oil on metal. Even the humblest tools had meaning. The wooden buckets, bound with iron, carried water and snow. Their worn staves told of years of service. The wooden shovel, banded with metal at its lip, cleared paths and shoveled drifts. John once asked why they did not buy newer things from town. His father looked at him, then tapped the shovel's handle. Because this one knows us. A new one would have to learn. The boy thought about that long after, realizing that what his father meant was simple. Reliability grew out of use, and trust was earned over time. Sarah had her own tools, no less vital. The spinning wheel by the hearth, its treadle steady beneath her foot, sang low songs of wool becoming yarn. Her needles, bone and steel, clicked softly as they grew socks and mittens row by row. She had scissors for cloth, straight pins she stored in a scrap of wool, a loom that filled the corner of the loft. To her, these were more than implements. They were lifelines, turning fleece and fiber into warmth. The children knew their mother's mending basket as well as their father's tool chest. When a knee tore through, Emma fetched the basket without being asked. When mittens thinned, Sarah patched them with wool scraps so deftly that the stitches seemed part of the design. A tool, she once said, is anything that takes a small thing and makes it last longer. The children nodded, though it would be years before they grasped the wisdom in those words. In winter, tools demanded respect. Steel left carelessly near the stove could crack when thrust into the cold. A saw left unfiled could bind at the wrong moment, wasting energy, perhaps even injuring someone. Handles, if not oiled, might split when most needed. And so each evening, Thomas or John tended to them, not as chores, but as rituals. The gleam of steel, the scent of linseed, the weight of a hammer in hand, all spoke of preparedness. There was another layer to it, one less obvious, but deeply felt. Each tool carried memory. The axe had once been Thomas's father's. The wheel had belonged to Sarah's mother. Even the smallest awl bore the mark of hands long gone. When the family used them, they joined a line stretching backward, a chain of survival. It gave strength, knowing that one was not alone, but working with the quiet company of ancestors. Sometimes, on evenings when the wind roared outside and the stove glowed within, Thomas would take down an old plane, its handle worn nearly smooth. He would run his hand along it, not working, simply remembering. John asked him once why he kept it when they seldom used it. "Because it reminds me," he said simply, "that once my father built, and now I build, and someday you will too." The storm could strip trees bare, freeze wells solid, bury barns in drifts, but it could not rob a family of its tools, nor of the knowledge carried in them. And so the Morrisons leaned on these companions of steel and wood, their handles polished by time, their edges kept keen. They were not just instruments. They were quiet promises that even in the hardest winters, there was always a way forward, so long as hands remained steady. Wisdom often came beside the fire's glow. Even as storms howled beyond the chinked walls, the cabin's heart beat steady at the hearth. It was here, in the dim glow of coals, that lessons, quiet as embers and enduring as oak, were passed from parent to child. For the Morrisons, these lessons were not spoken as sermons, but folded gently into the rhythm of evenings, woven between the creak of rocking chairs and the soft hiss of boiling water. The hearth was more than a stove. It was a circle, a place where light touched every face and shadows softened. On winter nights, after the day's labor was done, after wood had been cut, animals fed, quilts adjusted, and snowbanks shored against the cabin's walls, the family gathered there, some with mending in hand, some with a book or tool, some simply listening. And in that gathering, knowledge flowed like heat, invisible yet certain. Thomas spoke rarely, but when he did, his children leaned close. He taught them how to read a fire's moods, the high crackle that meant wood too green, the steady low burn of seasoned oak, the whisper of smoke that hinted at a clogged flue. A fire, he said once, is like a person. It needs air to breathe, food to live, and care to keep from turning wild. John repeated those words quietly to himself, as though committing them to Scripture. Sarah's lessons were gentler, though no less important. She taught Emma how to stretch cloth by candlelight so the weave showed true. She showed William and Michael how to mend seams, their small fingers clumsy but eager. She let them stir the mush pot, guiding their hands on the wooden spoon, warning them about steam, with a smile instead of fear. Every little act, she said softly, is practice for care. And care is what holds a house together. On some evenings, Thomas opened the old family Bible, its pages yellowed, its cover cracked. He read aloud, not to press faith upon the children, but to remind them that words, too, were tools of survival. When his voice filled the small room, the storm outside seemed less threatening, its roar diminished by the cadence of psalms or parables. Then Emma would take the book, haltingly reading her own passages. Each syllable gained strength in the firelight, as though the hearth itself gave her courage. Other nights carried stories, tales of Thomas's own boyhood winters when cabins were smaller still and firewood scarcer. He told of his father teaching him how to bank coals beneath ash, how to listen for wolves without letting fear rule his heart. Sarah, too, had her stories, of her mother spinning wool through long nights, of neighbors gathering when one cabin's roof sagged under snow, of kindnesses exchanged in silence. The children listened, their eyes wide, their imaginations warmed by images of endurance. John's questions came steadily. Why does frost creep inside the windows? Why can't we burn pine all night? Why do some families leave the valley after one winter? Each question opened a door, and Thomas, with patience, led him through. He explained how pine left creosote in the chimney, how frost was a meeting of warm breath and bitter air, how unprepared neighbors sometimes returned east because winter asked more than they had learned to give. The cold doesn't care, he said, but knowledge keeps us. The children learned not only facts, but habits. Emma began checking the quilts over the windows each evening without being told. William fetched wood and stacked it neatly by size, a small echo of his father's meticulousness. Even Michael, barely old enough to speak clearly, mimicked his mother's knitting. his fingers looping scraps of yarn with solemn concentration. These were not games, but rehearsals, each act a step toward the competence that winter demanded. The hearth carried laughter, too. Sometimes Thomas hummed old tunes while sharpening a blade, and Sarah joined with soft harmony. Emma teased John when he stumbled over a word, and he retaliated with exaggerated flourishes of reading until both dissolved in giggles. Even little Catherine, tucked in Sarah's lap, gurgled and clapped her hands at the sparks that flew when the poker stirred the coals. Laughter, Thomas once said, is another kind of fire, and indeed it spread warmth as surely as oak logs. Yet beneath the comfort lay the steady weight of responsibility. Every lesson had an unspoken edge, that forgetting, neglecting, or ignoring could mean more than inconvenience. It could mean frost-bitten fingers, smoke in the lungs, or a roof sagging under snow. The children sensed this, even if it was not said aloud. They felt it in the seriousness of their parents' voices, in the careful way tools were handled, in the quiet prayers Sarah whispered before sleep. One evening, when the storm outside had raged for hours without pause, Thomas handed John the iron poker. "Your turn," he said. John hesitated, then approached the stove, his face red with heat and nerves. He lifted the lid, examined the coals, placed 2 pieces of oak just so, then adjusted the damper. The fire responded, flames licking steadily upward. Thomas nodded once, a small gesture heavy with approval. That night, John slept with a deeper pride than he had ever known. So the lessons by the hearth continued, night after night, storm after storm. They were not written down, not measured in ink or paper, but lived, remembered in hands and hearts. The Morrisons knew that one day these children would carry the same wisdom to their own families, teaching beside their own hearths. The chain would continue, unbroken, held together by the simplest of truths. That warmth, both of fire and of love, could be kept only by tending. Cold tested not just walls, but flesh and spirit. Winter on the frontier tested more than cabins and woodpiles. It tested skin, lungs, joints, and nerves. It tested patience with a body that often seemed to betray itself when cold grew too deep. In the Morrison household, the family knew these silent trials well. They spoke little of them, but each creak of bone, each blistered hand, each cracked lip was a story of survival, no less important than the fire that burned in the stove. The children learned first through fingers. A day of hauling snow for melting, or a morning of splitting kindling, left their small hands raw, the skin reddened, the nails brittle. Sarah kept a small tin near the hearth, filled with bear grease mixed with beeswax, a recipe her mother had sworn by. Each night she rubbed the ointment into her children's hands and her husband's cracked knuckles, the smell sharp but comforting. "This keeps the skin from giving up," she whispered. "Skin must hold fast, or the cold finds its way in." Feet, too, bore the brunt of the season. Even with 2, sometimes 3, pairs of wool socks, the Morrison children often returned from chores with toes numb and aching. Thomas taught them to check their own feet before bed, pressing gently, making sure warmth returned, watching for the pale patches that might mean frostbite's first whisper. He told them of a neighbor long ago who had ignored the signs, and by spring he walked with a limp for the rest of his life. "The cold is patient," Thomas said. "It waits for carelessness." Breath itself was a hazard. The air, sharp as glass, cut throats and burned lungs. John once coughed so hard after hauling wood in the pre-dawn dark that Sarah feared sickness. She brewed a tea of pine needles, rich in scent, sharp on the tongue, and made him sip slowly by the stove. The warmth of the liquid eased the ache, but it was the patience of her hand at his back, steady as the fire's glow, that lingered longest. Sleep carried its own challenges. On the coldest nights, despite layered quilts and heated stones, the children's teeth chattered as they tried to rest. Emma often woke to find her little brothers burrowed close against her, their breaths frosting the quilts. She would hold them, whispering nonsense words, anything to lull them back into slumber. Meanwhile, Sarah rose quietly to check the stove, adjusting the damper with care. No one spoke of these interruptions. They became part of the rhythm of winter nights. The body's hunger was another trial. Cornmeal mush and salted pork filled the stomach but never fully satisfied it. Energy burned faster in the cold, and the children grew leaner even as Sarah ladled larger portions. She watched carefully, keeping the last of the dried apples for nights when spirits drooped. A taste of sweetness, rare as sunlight, lifted more than the body. It fed hope. Sickness lurked like a shadow. Cold spread easily in the close cabin, and with no doctor nearer than 50 miles, remedies were homemade. Sarah relied on onion poultices, teas of sage and mint, hot compresses warmed by the stove. Once, when Michael's cough deepened, Thomas spent an entire night feeding the fire, unwilling to let the cabin cool even a degree. "The body fights better in warmth," he murmured, eyes fixed on the stove's glowing seams. By dawn, the boy's breathing eased, though worry clung for days. Even strength of mind bent under winter's weight. Days without sunlight thinned patience. Silence pressed heavy, and tempers sometimes flared at the smallest slight. Emma once snapped at William for spilling water, her voice sharp as the wind outside. But moments later she wept, ashamed, and Sarah gathered her close. "The cold works at us all," she said gently. "It makes us hard where we should be soft. That's why we must forgive quickly. Forgiveness, too, was a kind of medicine." Thomas bore his own hidden aches. Swinging the axe, hauling wood, clearing drifts left his back stiff, his shoulders knotted. Yet he seldom admitted pain. Only when Sarah pressed a warm cloth to his spine at night, her hands firm and knowing. Did he allow himself a sigh? "The cabin stands because you stand," she teased softly. He answered with silence, but the gratitude in his eyes glowed brighter than the stove. Through these trials, the children came to understand that winter survival was not only about walls or fires, but about tending the body as faithfully as one tended the hearth. A cracked hand could mean lost work. A chilled child could mean sickness. A careless moment could mean injury no one could repair in time. And so they learned vigilance, gentleness, and patience with themselves and each other. The storm outside might roar with force, but the quiet battles within the skin and bones of each family member mattered just as much. Each ointment rubbed in, each extra log placed on the fire, each cup of steaming tea carried to trembling hands was a victory. Not grand, not loud, but steady. The kind of victory that strung days together until spring. They heard spring long before they saw it. It did not begin with birds, though a chickadee tried a brave note one morning and then thought better of it. Nor did it begin with warmth. The air still bit the inside of the nose and made eyelashes grow heavy with frost. It began with a sound so small the family almost missed it. The soft, shy drip from the eaves at noon. A single bell struck in water. The dog noticed first, lifting his head from the warm square of floor and pointing his nose toward the door as if a guest had tapped. Sarah looked up from her mending, listened, and smiled. "He's thinking about it," she said, meaning winter. "He's thinking of letting go." Signs gathered the way crumbs do when a good loaf is sliced. Smoke went straight up in the mornings, the wind too tired to push it sideways. At midday, the snow on the south wall sagged just a finger's breadth, and the icy lace on the oiled paper window relaxed into drops that wandered down like handwriting. In the shed, the pump handle grudged a little less, and the cow, who had stood all season in the patient posture of endurance, turned her head to the door and breathed as if remembering grass. Nothing was warm, not yet, but the world had shifted its weight. 3 days of such small mercies, and talk turned, as it always did when a winter blinked, to the gathering. Each cold season, the valley chose one long day to be larger than a single cabin. The Hendersons had the widest room and a roof that did not complain under snow. By custom, their door went first. Thomas tied the idea to a stake of reason. "Roads firm by noon, soft by afternoon," he said. "We go in the bright and home by starlight." Sarah nodded, already counting what could be spared for the common table and what could be shown for the common good. Preparations were the kind that make a house feel taller. Sarah brought out a cloth she saved for company, not because the cloth mattered, but because devotion does. She baked corn pones with the last spoon of molasses brushed on top to make a glaze that caught light like amber. Emma slid a pair of finished mittens from her lap, double-lined, thumbs reinforced with a neat ladder stitch, and tucked them into a basket alongside a bundle of scraps and needles. She would show the trick Martha asked about, the way to turn an old cuff into a warm palm. John, proud of the edge he had put on the draw knife last week, wrapped the tool in sailcloth. The men would want to see the set of its teeth, and he wanted to stand nearby when they did. Thomas oiled the harness and checked the runners, tracing his palm along wood that had learned the valley's creases. He packed a small chest, a whetstone, a spare wedge, a twist of wire, a tin of ash sift for chinking, and 3 paper-wrapped bundles of kindling so fine and dry they seemed to hum even in the cold. "Gifts," he said, not to boast, but because giving kept his hands as warm as any mittens. He tucked one more thing into the chest, almost as an afterthought, a strip of leather pre-cut to the size of a stubborn latch. Every cabin in March had a latch that took offense at thaw. By late morning, the light had sharpened. Snow held a glaze that rang under a boot heel. The family moved like a small caravan across the field, sled whispering, children lifting their feet high to keep the crust from scalding their shins. Breath rose in white braids. Above them, the sky had not changed color, but it had softened its tone, the hard blue of January giving way to something that remembered April. They were not alone on the road of snow. A mile on, the Henderson Trail crossed the Pattersons, and from the north the slight figure of Mary Henderson could be seen waiting at the bend, her shawl pulled up, her wave efficient and bright. Behind her came others, dark commas on the white page, neighbors from stands of timber and from the flat, each dragging a small part of their house behind them, a pot with a lid tied down, a sack of dried fruit, a bundle of clothes to trade, a shy child peering over the sled's load like a sailor studying shore. The Henderson cabin threw a welcome you could hear. Laughter set its own draft when doors open and people fall into each other's voices. Steam rose from pots on the big stove, and an extra table had been made from 2 sawhorses and a door, the old latch scar visible like the crease on a good hand. Boots thudded, scarves unwound, cheeks bloomed red, then calmed. The room filled with that kind of busy that does not confuse itself with hurry. The exchange began without anyone naming it. Sarah set her corn pones on the table and slid into a circle where women compared threads. Mary showed the new spin she had learned from a Swedish family north of the river, a long draw that made yarn even on the thinnest wool. She rolled a sliver between finger and thumb, and the wheel purred as if pleased to be included. Martha stood close, paying the kind of attention that sows itself into the fingers. When Sarah produced her tiny tin of bear grease salve, a hum went around the room, the sound women make when they recognize a tool disguised as a kindness. Drops were shared to heal knuckles split by 1,000 buckets. On the far side, men fitted their shoulders together in a long, easy line. Someone set the draw knife on the table. Thomas showed, with the economy of a man who prefers doing to naming, how a blade can confess its dullness before it cuts. He passed the whetstone around. Each hand tested its fine truth. There was a small, useful argument about tooth set on a crosscut, and someone told a short tale of a saw that had pulled to the right for 7 winters because no one had wanted to admit the handle was sprung. The tale ended with a chuckle and a vow to check handles before blaming teeth. Children organized without instruction. Older ones showed younger ones how to stagger a boot on slick steps, how to warm the nap of a wet mitten against a stove leg without singing it, how to hold a cup so the heat kisses the fingertips first. A game began under the table with a bit of twine that could be a fence or a river, depending on who lifted which end. Buck, who had never in his life been honored as a guest but suspected he might be today, found a patch of sun by the door and arranged his ribs in a geometry of satisfaction. The sheer fact of a room full of people made even the dog believe the world tended to good. The meal, when it came, did not pretend to plenty. It pretended to belonging, which is better. A pot of beans rich with onion, a thin stew that had learned depth from patience, bread in enough varieties to feel like a parade, a pie that someone, with comic secrecy, had sprigged with dried berries as if spring could be laid under a crust. Grace was said by a man with a quiet voice and a face shaped by wind. His words were less about asking than about naming what had already been given: hands, breath, a roof, the habit of hope. After, the room turned to show and share, the valley's proper liturgy. Emma, not without color in her cheeks, sat by the window and demonstrated the mitten palm trick. Cuff turned inside out, cut on the fold, thumb set low to follow the bend of living hands. Martha watched with that determined calm that makes children sleep. Across the room, Thomas lifted the lid on the Henderson stovepipe and showed the pinch of soot that tells a man to clean now, not tomorrow. He spoke softly to Henry McClintock at the edge of the circle, the way one man speaks to another when pride has had a hard winter. "Split along the light," he said again, but this time he put a wedge in Henry's palm and curled the fingers around it, a sacrament of steel. A small shock visited, as shocks prefer to do, in a tone chosen not to frighten. The Henderson lamp, warming on the shelf, gave a fine crack around its neck, a ring no wider than a thread. Conversation paused in that look-up way a room has when glass speaks. Without bustle, 3 women and 2 men crossed the space of floor that trouble makes. Wire found wire, tape found tape. The fracture was girdled and seated. Mary, smiling, trimmed the wick to a gentle crescent, and when the flame stood up straight again, a pleased murmur ran like a tide. What could have ruined an evening had been invited to sit down and behave. Outside, the noon snow set glossy, then went dull as the sun drifted west. Inside, the gathering climbed to its quiet peak. No speech marked it, no song made it official, though a hymn did rise later, low and certain, the kind the valley keeps for times when voices want company. The peak was this. In the shared air of that room, the winter changed shape. It grew smaller, not because the wind was finished, but because the space between houses had been stitched with names and handwork and the borrowed tools of friends. If there is a climax in a season like this, it is not weather. It is a room where no one is alone. Trade followed, the neighborly arithmetic of winter, a set of buttons for a spool of thread, a promise of a day's help on a roof for the loan of a fro. Sarah's salve tin went lighter, and under her elbow appeared a paper twist of dried chamomile from Mary's summer garden. Emma's mittens found a home on a pair of small hands whose mother had come thin to this valley. John swapped a pair of perfect kindling bundles for a lesson on setting a felling notch that would not make a tree buck. Everyone went home richer without much being said. Dusk squared its shoulders in the window, the room cooled by 1 polite degree. Coats were found. Children were herded from under tables. Dogs, called by names they were happy to forget, sighed and stood. Thomas lifted the chest, lighter now, and the sled sang again over the hard snow. Stars came on slowly, each one choosing its place with care. Breath rose in little ladders. Boots squeaked in that high note deep cold keeps for itself. The road home felt shorter, as homeward roads do. The valley, which had been a white fact for months, became a map again. This fence, that willow, the bend where the creek remembers rain. The Morrison house waited with its small plume of smoke. Sarah, stepping through the door, felt the room's shape meet her exactly. Every chair and hook was where the hand expected. Emma tucked the new scrap of wool into the mending basket, as if adding a page to a book she would keep for the rest of her life. John laid the draw knife back on its peg and ran his thumb along the edge, not to test it, but to greet it. Later, after an easy supper born mostly of the day's plenty, the family sat with the kind of tired that pays good wages. Thomas banked the fire with an experienced hand, oak crosswise, ash as veil, damper at the tick between generous and frugal. He looked at Sarah, and something like the whole winter passed between them without the expense of words. They had been carried, and they had carried others, and both mattered equally. The drip from the eaves visited once more at midnight, then once again, just before dawn. The dog's paws twitched in dream, chasing some corridor of scent only a good dog knows. Wind ran a finger along the seam of the north wall, and finding the chink true, went to look for mischief elsewhere. In that eased house, the Morrisons slept the sort of sleep that makes a season turn, and if winter had one more cold breath to blow, and it surely did, the family would meet it, made larger by a roomful of neighbors, and a day spent proving, gently and completely, that survival is a plural word. The memory of winter carried them forward. When March at last began to unclench its fists, the signs were modest, almost shy. The creek, long sealed beneath glass, opened a thumb-wide ribbon where water dared to run. Geese traced a ragged V across the pale sky, their calls breaking the hush as if to remind the valley that journeys continue. In the Morrison cabin, windows were still quilt-covered, the stove still fed with oak and hickory, but the air carried a promise that the family could almost taste. The rhythm of days softened. No longer did Thomas strike the morning fire with the ferocity of a soldier. Instead, he tended it with the measured ease of a keeper who knows the worst battles are behind. Sarah still stacked wood carefully, still rubbed salve into chapped hands, but she hummed more often, small tunes that had waited all winter at the edge of her breath. Emma, who had grown from girl to young woman in the length of a season, read aloud more confidently by lamplight, her voice finding the notes of patience her parents had long practiced. John, his shoulders broader from months of labor, began to test his independence in small ways. He rose before dawn to start kindling without being asked. He measured snow against the north wall and announced with quiet pride when it no longer reached the windowsill. He even began to guide William and Michael in chores, showing them how to stack wood by size, how to bank coals with ash so a fire would last till morning. In these moments, Thomas saw not just his son, but the future shape of a man who had listened well beside the hearth. Outside, the valley bore scars and gifts in equal measure. Snow still lay deep in hollows, but on the south-facing slopes, patches of brown earth yawned open, eager to breathe. Chickens scratched tentatively at thawed ground, and the cow, thin from the long fast of winter, lifted her head to sniff winds that carried scents beyond hay and frost. Even Buck, the faithful dog, ran in circles that day, his paws leaving an excited script across the softened crust. The memory of hardship did not vanish with the thaw. It lived in the lines of Thomas's hands, in Sarah's watchful eyes, in the children's quick response to any draft. They carried the season as one carries a stone in a pocket, not heavy enough to bend the back, but solid enough to remind the hand it is there. Around the table, talk turned to planting, to repairs, to the hope of summer stores. Yet always, beneath the words, lay the quiet knowledge. They had endured again. The community, too, emerged from its winter hushed and changed. When neighbors gathered once more, this time without fear of blizzard, there was laughter easier than before, laughter that cracked like ice giving way to water. Stories of trials were exchanged, not as boasts, but as confessions. One family spoke of using furniture for firewood. Another shared how they had huddled under one quilt all together when coals failed. Each tale, heavy in the telling, grew lighter in the sharing. Survival was never solitary. It was a chorus, and every voice mattered. On a clear evening, Thomas led John to the ridge above their land. Snow still clung in streaks, but the valley lay open, wide and expectant. "You'll see this again and again," he said quietly. "Winters that press, springs that ease. What we learn in one carries us through the next." John listened, the words pressing into him like seeds waiting for rain. He understood then that endurance was not only about wood and stone, but about remembering, carrying, and passing on. Back at the cabin, Sarah sat by the stove one last night with her sewing, candlelight trembling on her cheek. She folded away winter garments, patched and repatched, and laid out lighter clothes for the children. Emma placed the Bible on the shelf with reverence, its worn cover now bearing the trace of another season's reading. William and Michael played with wooden blocks, no longer just a game, but practice for hands that would one day build. Catherine, sleepy and content, pressed her face into her mother's shawl, as if spring itself had already arrived in the warmth of her embrace. When Thomas banked the fire that night, he did so with a gentleness reserved for endings. He placed the logs as if closing a book, layering ash over coals as if tucking children into bed. The stove's glow dimmed to a soft heartbeat, steady enough to last until morning. He paused, hand on the iron door, and listened to the faint drip of meltwater, to the sigh of timbers relaxing, to the quiet breathing of his family. It was a chorus of life that winter had not silenced. And so, as dawn approached, the Morrison family slept easily, their cabin no longer a fortress against storms, but a home opening its arms to gentler days. Outside, winter lingered still in shadows, but its voice was fading. Inside, warmth remained, not only in the stove, but in the lessons, laughter, and love that had carried them through. The echo of winter would stay with them always, a reminder not of fear, but of strength found in each other, of hands that mended, of fires tended, of nights survived. And in that echo, spring found its welcome. The hearth once guarded life, now it warms for comfort. Step back with me, gently, as though we were turning the last page of a long and careful book. The Morrison family's winter, as we followed them through those 18 chapters, was not only a season, it was a trial, a shaping, and a way of life. Their fire was more than a flicker of light in the dark. It was the pulse of survival. Every ember mattered. A single mistake, a draft through the wall, a log cut too green, could shift the line between life and loss. Now, in our time, the hearth still glows, but for most of us, it glows in memory, or in the leisure of a fireplace lit on a holiday evening. Central heating hums unseen in the walls, thermostats click quietly, and a house holds steady warmth without asking us to wake at midnight, without demanding kindling split by a 12-year-old's hand. The fire that once meant life itself has been reduced to a choice. A soft crackle for mood, the fragrance of cedar for nostalgia. In the 19th century, each family carried survival in their arms, on their backs, in their fingers. Firewood stacked against the wall was wealth, measured not in coin, but in cords. Stones heated at dusk and slipped beneath quilts were treasure. Sleep bought with the slow release of warmth. The labor was constant. It left no space for forgetting. Winter tested daily, and daily they answered. Contrast that with our present nights. If the furnace stops, a repair service can be called. Spare blankets lie in closets, supermarkets stand lit at every corner, and weather forecasts arrive on glowing screens with precision the Morrisons could never imagine. No child in today's suburban bedroom waits to hear whether embers caught at dawn, nor is there fear that a chimney's damming of ice might fill a cabin with smoke. The fire is hidden in wires and vents, and its fragility rarely crosses our thoughts. But it is worth pausing to note what we have traded. Convenience spares us labor, yes, but it also blurs the sharp edges of awareness. The Morrisons knew their fire intimately, the way a log's grain whispered of its burn, the way air moved when the damper shifted. Their children, even in youth, learned responsibility in the rhythm of flame. In our age, warmth arrives at the flick of a switch, but the lessons it once taught, patience, vigilance, humility, are seldom carried into adulthood. Think of the hands, Sarah's, rough with salve and stitches, Thomas's, stiff from axe and saw. Those hands were written on by winter. Today our hands are softened by lotion, warmed by insulated gloves, turned to keyboards rather than hatchets. We have escaped the pain of cracked skin, but we also escape the intimacy of knowing how to mend it with bear grease or beeswax. The cost of comfort is forgetting. Still, the echo remains. We keep candles in drawers, perhaps without thinking why. We save old quilts, layered thick, even when modern bedding could suffice. Some part of us remembers, buried deep, that warmth was once a covenant with survival. That is why hearths draw us still, even in houses that no longer need them. A fire burning is not just decoration, it stirs something older, something that whispers, "Here is life, here is safety." The Morrison winter, those long chapters we have just walked through, was not unique. It was the common shape of life less than 2 centuries ago. Each ember, each snowbank pressed against a wall, each stone wrapped in cloth carried the story of a people who refused to let cold define them. Today, we rarely face such trials, and yet, in a curious way, we long for them, retelling their stories, lighting fires not for survival, but for memory, and gathering around their glow to remind ourselves what it meant to endure. Once every crumb was guarded. Now shelves overflow without thought. When we think back on the Morrison family's winter table, we recall its simplicity. Cornmeal mush, a strip of salt pork reserved for the rare morning, black coffee ladled with care. The table did not groan with abundance. It balanced, slender as a tightrope, between enough and too little. Every meal was a calculation, every spoonful a measure against what remained in the cellar, what might still come before spring. In those days, food was not bought. It was prepared, preserved, carried forward like a promise. Salt pork hung from rafters, its very existence the result of butchering, salting, smoking, and the prayer that mold would not take it before hunger did. Cornmeal came from autumn's harvest, ground by hand or traded at cost, its golden dust both sustenance and security. Even a jar of beans was more than a side dish. It was an investment of summer labor, dried in the heat of August, so that January would not prove fatal. Children learned early that waste was a form of sin. A crust left uneaten was not merely untidy, it was dangerous, a surrender to scarcity. Families counted jars, measured scoops, divided portions with the solemnity of ritual. Sarah's sigh when she saw ice sealing the water bucket was not only about thirst. It was the knowledge that melting snow consumed firewood, which consumed strength, which meant food would be needed all the sooner. Now let us place that picture beside our modern pantry. We walk into stores where rows upon rows of shelves gleam beneath fluorescent light. Apples arrive in January, though no blossom graced our own orchards. Bread comes sliced, sealed, and stamped with a date meant only to remind us of freshness, not survival. Freezers hum softly, their cold a luxury that 19th century families could only have dreamed of, their shelves stacked with meals that require no more labor than pressing a button. It is progress, yes, remarkable progress. We no longer fear that a blizzard will trap us without sustenance. No child of ours goes to bed praying that salted beans will stretch another week. Hunger, in much of our world, has shifted from a threat at the door to a distant echo. Yet with that security comes a quiet amnesia. The Morrison children knew the taste of scarcity. We know the taste of choice. We measure meals not in survival, but in preference. And what of gratitude? For the Morrisons, every meal was a celebration of foresight. The wood chopped in spring that smoked the pork in fall, the hours of shelling beans by the stove, the careful layering of jars in a root cellar dug by hand. A bowl of cornmeal mush was not a complaint. It was the visible proof of 1,000 small labors bound together. Today, gratitude is harder to summon when abundance is constant. Our tables may hold more, but our hearts do not always notice. There is another contrast. The Morrison family ate together in silence, not because they lacked love, but because winter meals were about conserving heat and strength, talking wasted breath. Energy was precious. Now, meals are often scattered across schedules, eaten in cars, or consumed in the glow of television screens. Food nourishes our bodies, but rarely our sense of unity. In saving ourselves from hunger, we have sometimes lost the quiet fellowship of a shared table. Still, echoes remain. Families gather at holidays, recreating feasts that once meant survival. We roast turkeys and bake pies not because they are necessary, but because they remind us of an older rhythm. The gathering of harvest, the storing of plenty, the gratitude for another year endured. In those moments, we touch the Morrison table again, even if only in memory. The old families did not dream of grocery aisles, but they dreamed of security, of children who would not cry from empty bellies. We live in their dream now. And yet, it is worth asking, what do we dream of with our full shelves and easy meals? Perhaps it is not more food we seek, but more meaning, something the Morrisons, in their hunger and their diligence, already knew. Cabins once bent beneath storms. Today, houses hum with quiet ease. When the Morrisons settled in Montana's wilderness, their home was not just a structure of logs and clay. It was a lifeline. The cabin stood as both shield and sanctuary, built with hands that knew every notch mattered. A misplaced cut, a poorly sealed seam, and the night air would slip in, sharp as knives. Survival was not in the grand shape of the house, but in the smallest details. Moss pressed into gaps, clay mixed with hair, snow banked against north walls to hold back the howling wind. In those days, walls were not assumed to be solid. They were tested every hour of every storm. Frost traced its silver fingers along the inside logs. Windows, covered with oiled paper and layered quilts, trembled when gales struck. The floor, raised with pine boughs, still breathed cold into bare feet. Families lived within their cabins as within a fragile shell, one crack away from collapse. The Morrison children knew the draft that whispered from a window seam as intimately as they knew their own heartbeat. Contrast that to today. Modern houses rise with insulated frames, sealed glass, and foundations poured by machines. We no longer press moss into walls. We press buttons on thermostats. Cold air does not seep in unless we open the door ourselves. Storms pound on the roof, but shingles and gutters stand firm, their failure an inconvenience, not a death sentence. Warmth circulates invisibly through ducts and vents, unconsidered and unearned, humming softly like a lullaby we have forgotten to appreciate. Yet consider what was gained and what was lost. For the Morrisons, shelter was not just protection. It was a constant relationship. The cabin spoke to them. It groaned when snow weighed heavy, whispered when chinking failed, sighed when firelight warmed its joints. They listened, and in listening, they learned resilience. Our houses are quieter, but in their silence, we lose that intimate dialogue. We do not know the sound of timbers easing in frost, or the scent of clay drying near a stove. We trust walls blindly, and so we forget what they mean. The difference shows in labor, too. A Morrison winter demanded repairs in the darkest hours. A draft discovered at midnight was patched by lantern light. Snowbanks had to be rebuilt after every storm, shoulders straining against drifts. Even roof ice had to be chopped away, lest water dam and ruin the cabin when spring thawed. Each task tied family to home in a rhythm as natural as breath. Today, when a furnace hums wrong or a roof leaks, we call a service, schedule an appointment, and wait. The urgency is gone, replaced by reliance on others. Children once grew up with tools in their hands. John learned to stack logs by shape. Emma knew how to seal a seam with clay. These were not hobbies, but inheritance, skills pressed down through generations. Now, children grow without such knowledge, their hands shaped for screens rather than hatchets. They live in houses stronger than any log wall, yet weaker in the bond between shelter and self. Still, echoes remain. We hang quilts on walls for beauty, not warmth, yet the instinct is the same. We gather around fireplaces, though furnaces already warm us. We patch gardens' sheds, line cracks with caulk, shovel driveways, and in these small moments, touch a sliver of what it meant to guard a cabin against winter. And when storms cut power and heat fails, we are reminded, suddenly, sharply, of how thin our comfort truly is. The Morrison walls were rough, uneven, patched and repatched, yet they held. They bore the prints of every hand, the weight of every winter. Our walls are smooth, unmarked, forgettable. But perhaps, in remembering theirs, we can honor both. The fragility of shelter once fought for, and the security we now inherit without thought. Once survival leaned on neighbors. Now, connections flicker through screens. Picture again the Morrison's Valley, where cabins stood miles apart, their smoke trails the only sign of human presence in the white sweep of winter. In such a world, neighbors were not simply acquaintances. They were lifelines. A knock at the door might bring salt, or news, or warning. A sled's path cut through drifts meant someone had chosen to risk frostbite for the sake of another. To live apart was impossible. To live together was survival itself. The Morrison family knew the pattern well. When Thomas trudged through waist-deep snow to check on the McClintocks, it was not a favor, but an obligation written into frontier life. Just as old Jim Barker once helped them, so they in turn extended knowledge, food, and tools. Community was not organized by committees or offices. It was written in the snow trails between cabins, in the shared wisdom of how to bank a fire or save a cow from freezing. Neighbors were teachers too. Martha McClintock, desperate to keep her children's toes warm, absorbed Sarah Morrison's lesson about heated stones as if it were scripture. Knowledge leapt from household to household, like sparks from one hearth to another. There was pride, of course. Henry hesitated to admit ignorance, but pride yielded quickly to necessity. Winter stripped away pretenses. Help was the only currency worth spending. Now look at us. We live side by side, our houses pressed within arm's reach. Yet we may not know the names of those across the fence. The hum of delivery trucks replaces the knock of a neighbor bearing bread. Connection flickers through glowing screens, efficient but strangely hollow. We scroll through messages while the faces next door remain unknown. Our survival does not rest on one another, and so we forget how to depend. Yet convenience has not replaced the need entirely. When storms knock out power lines, when hurricanes rise or wildfires threaten, suddenly we rediscover that ancient truth. Strangers share generators, pass out bottled water, clear debris together. Crisis summons the memory that once lived daily, that humans endure better when they endure together. The difference is frequency. For the Morrisons, community was not a choice. It was a rhythm of life. For us, it is occasional, awakened only when disaster breaks routine. The Morrison children absorbed this lesson early. Emma knew she might need to walk miles with food or help tend another family's fire. John learned that carrying wood for a neighbor was as vital as for his own. These tasks shaped their sense of belonging, not as a luxury, but as duty. Today, children learn about sharing in classrooms, but rarely see it tested in ways that determine warmth or hunger. Our lessons in kindness are gentler, less costly, but perhaps also less binding. Still, echoes remain. Churches, clubs, and small-town traditions preserve pieces of that frontier ethic. Potlucks, quilting bees, even neighborhood watch groups carry the DNA of those older gatherings where knowledge and resources were pooled. And when we look at one another across fences or hallways, some instinct stirs. A memory of snowbound nights when one more hand could mean one more life. The Morrisons' neighbors were few, their distances great, but their bonds deep. Our neighbors are many, their distances small, but their bonds often shallow. And yet, in both times the truth shines. No one survives alone. Then it was storms. Now it is loneliness, noise, the demands of modern pace. The form has shifted, but the need remains the same. Once survival tested every bone. Now it tests quieter corners of the soul. The winter we traced with the Morrisons was not only about fire, food, and walls. It was about endurance. The quiet, stubborn strength that kept them rising from bed when the cold bit like iron, kept them sawing through frozen oak, kept them melting snow long after hands had numbed. Endurance was their constant companion, worn like a second skin. For Thomas, endurance lived in the muscles of his back and the grip of his hands. He could not rest because his family's warmth depended on his vigilance. For Sarah, it lived in her patience, in the endless sewing, stirring, mending, soothing. For Emma and John, it was the lesson of growing older before their time, stepping into responsibilities that children today can hardly imagine. Even the littlest ones endured, shivering beneath quilts, learning not to complain, trusting in the rhythm of care around them. Now, step into our present moment. The winters still arrive, but our endurance is tested differently. Rarely must we break ice from a barn roof or burn furniture to save coals. Instead, our challenges are more invisible. Long commutes, screens glowing late into the night, the quiet weight of loneliness in crowded cities. The body is spared what the Morrisons knew, but the spirit carries burdens of another kind. It is easy to think we are softer now. Our hands are less calloused, our backs less strained by axe and saw. Yet endurance has not vanished. It has simply shifted. Where they fought the howl of the wind, we fight the hum of constant demands. Where they measured survival in cords of wood, we measure it in hours of rest snatched from hurried days. Both forms wear us down, though in different guises. There is a lesson in looking back. The Morrisons' endurance was communal. No one faced the storm alone. Each carried a piece of the burden, the children fetching snow, the mother tending the fire, the father cutting wood. Today, endurance often feels solitary. We push through tasks quietly, telling few of our fatigue. Perhaps in this, we have lost something, the sharing of effort that made hardship bearable. And yet, there is continuity too. Human beings, then and now, find ways to last. We adapt, we invent, we lean on small comforts. A Morrison child pressed a warm stone to her feet and drifted to sleep. We press a switch and let soft music play through the night. The tools change, but the need does not. Looking back across the 18 chapters of Winter and the reflections that followed, one truth holds steady. Endurance is not only about surviving storms, but about carrying memory forward. The Morrison family endured so that their children would live to build, so that we, generations later, might sit in homes where warmth is easy, food abundant, walls secure. Our endurance, though different, is still tied to theirs. The fire they coaxed into life is the same fire we recall when we light a candle on a dark evening. The story of then and now is not meant to make us ashamed of our ease, nor to romanticize their hardship. It is meant to remind us that every comfort rests upon someone else's endurance. The Morrisons bore the cold so their children might see spring. We inherit that spring, and our task is to remember. And so the journey ends, not with frost, but with gratitude. The Morrisons' winter is behind us, our comforts before us, yet the thread between them remains unbroken. May it guide us gently into rest, into dreams where endurance takes its softest form. Peace.